What I'm about to tell you happened several years ago when I was 25 and had just moved into my first apartment alone in Portland, Oregon. It was a 2-story building constructed in the 1960s with modest but well-maintained apartments. I had saved for 2 years to afford living independently, and I felt proud and excited about this new chapter of my life. My apartment was 2B, a cozy 1-bedroom space with large windows overlooking the building's backyard garden. It was perfect for me. Enough natural light, a functional kitchen, and most importantly, a price I could manage with my salary as an administrative assistant at a local accounting firm. The building had 6 apartments in total. I met most of my neighbors during my first weeks there, an elderly couple in 1A, a college student in 2A directly across from my door, and a working mother with 2 young children in 1C. They all seemed like normal, friendly people who respected each other's privacy. Apartment 2C, at the end of the second-floor hallway, had been vacant since I moved in. According to the landlady, Mrs. Peterson, the previous tenant had moved out suddenly, leaving the apartment available. I didn't mind. In fact, I liked the quiet of not having an immediate neighbor next door. Everything changed in October, about 2 months after I moved in. One Saturday morning, while I was drinking coffee and reading the newspaper at my small kitchen table, I heard moving noises in the hallway. I looked through my door's peephole and saw 2 men carrying boxes and furniture into apartment 2C. Over the next few days, I occasionally crossed paths with my new neighbor in the hallways or at the building's entrance. He was a middle-aged man, maybe 38 or 40 years old, thin but not frail, with dark brown hair that always seemed perfectly combed back. He dressed impeccably, always in pressed dress shirts and slacks, even on weekends. The first thing I noticed about him was the way he looked at me. When we passed each other, he didn't just greet me politely like the other neighbors. His eyes lingered on me a little too long, scanning me up and down in a way that made me feel uncomfortable. Initially, I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe it was my imagination or that he was socially awkward. "Hi," he said one morning as we both collected our mail from the first-floor mailboxes. "I'm David Miller from 2C. "Amanda," I replied politely, forcing a smile. "Welcome to the building." "Thanks. It's a very quiet place. Perfect for observing," he said, and something about the way he said that last word sent chills down my spine. "Yeah, it's pretty peaceful," I responded, trying to end the conversation quickly. "I've noticed you have a very regular schedule," David continued, subtly blocking my exit from the mailbox area. "You leave every day at 8:15, come back around 6. Very disciplined." His observation alarmed me. Why had he been paying attention to my schedule? And why did he feel comfortable mentioning it? "Well, work demands a fixed schedule," I replied, trying to sound casual as I maneuvered past him toward the stairs. "Of course. Have a good day, Amanda." The way he said my name, stretching out each syllable slightly, made me feel like tiny insects were crawling on my skin. Over the next few weeks, I began noticing other strange behaviors from David. He seemed to have an uncanny ability to appear at the exact moments I left or returned to my apartment. At first, I thought it was coincidence, but it happened too frequently to be random. "What a coincidence running into you again," he'd say, with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. I started deliberately varying my schedule to avoid these encounters, leaving 10 minutes earlier or later than usual. But David seemed to adjust to my changes, as if he somehow knew what my new timings would be. One November afternoon, as I climbed the stairs after work, I noticed David standing in the second-floor hallway, seemingly checking his phone right outside my door. "Hi, Amanda," he said as I approached. "How was your day at the office?" I had never told him where I worked. "How do you know where I work?" I asked, stopping several steps from my door. "Oh, did I say your office?" His expression didn't change, but I could see a flicker of something, amusement, satisfaction, in his eyes. Must have been a guess. "Most people our age work in offices, I guess," I muttered, hurrying to my door and fumbling with my keys. My hands were trembling slightly. "Amanda," David said, his voice now closer than I expected. I turned, and he was standing less than a meter away. "Would you like to have dinner with me some night? I know a very intimate place nearby." "No thanks." I have a boyfriend," I lied. "I haven't seen any boyfriend," he responded immediately. Too quickly, too confidently. I managed to open my door and slipped inside, locking it immediately. From the other side, I heard David say softly, "Good night, Amanda." Sleep well. I couldn't sleep that night. The way he said he hadn't seen a boyfriend implied he had been paying specific attention to who came and went from my apartment. How long had he been watching me? The following days brought more disturbing behaviors. I began finding small gifts outside my door. Wildflowers clearly picked from the building's backyard garden. Magazines that matched my interests exactly, which terrified me because I had never discussed my hobbies with him. And once, a printed photograph of me walking down the street near the building. The photograph scared me the most. It was clearly taken without my knowledge, from a considerable distance, but with enough resolution to show my face clearly. On the back, in neat handwritten script, it read, "Beautiful as always, D." I went straight to Mrs. Peterson's office on the first floor. "Mrs. Peterson, I have some concerns about my new neighbor," I began, showing her the photograph. She examined it with a frown. "This is very odd, dear. Are you sure he took it? Who else could it be? It's signed with a D, and David is the only neighbor whose name starts with that letter. You're right. I'll talk to him about this. This kind of behavior isn't acceptable. I'd also like to know if you can install a security camera in the second floor hallway. I'd feel safer. I'll consider it, but cameras are expensive. In the meantime, if you have any more issues, document everything and call the police if necessary." Mrs. Peterson spoke to David that same day. That night, around 11, I heard soft knocking at my door. "Amanda," David's voice came through the door. "I know you're awake. I saw your light on." I didn't respond, hoping he'd leave. "Amanda, Mrs. Peterson told me you're upset about the photograph. I just wanted you to know how beautiful you look when you walk. I didn't think it would bother you." His words made me feel sick. It wasn't an apology. It was a justification. "I just want to be your friend, Amanda. We're neighbors. We should get along." The knocking continued, now more insistent. "Amanda, I know you can hear me. Don't be rude." Finally, after what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, the knocking stopped, and I heard his footsteps retreating. The next morning, I found a note slipped under my door. "Amanda, I'm sorry if I upset you last night. I just wanted to explain. You're a beautiful woman, and any man would be attracted to you. I hope we can be good neighbors. Your friend, David." The word friend was underlined 3 times. Things escalated quickly after that. David seemed to interpret my silence as an invitation to intensify his efforts. He began leaving more notes, flowers almost daily, and most disturbingly, small objects that seemed to reflect detailed knowledge about my personal life. One morning, I found a copy of my favorite childhood book, an obscure novel not available in local bookstores. The only way he could have known about this specific book was if he had been extensively scouring my social media, or worse, had been inside my apartment. That possibility terrified me. I started obsessively checking my apartment every night, looking for signs someone had been there. I changed the locks, installed additional deadbolts, and began placing small objects in specific spots to see if they were moved. A week after the book incident, I came home from work to find one of my favorite glasses, a unique one I'd bought at a thrift store, clean, and placed on my kitchen table. I was certain I had left it in the sink that morning with orange juice residue. I ran straight to Mrs. Peterson's office. "Mrs. Peterson, I think David has been entering my apartment," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "That's a very serious accusation, Amanda." "Do you have any proof?" I explained about the glass, the book, and other small details I'd noticed. "Dear, it's possible you just forgot where you place things." Stress can make us forget small details. "I'm not crazy," I protested. "I know someone has been in my apartment." "I didn't say you were crazy. I'm just suggesting you might be more upset than you realize about the situation with David." "Have you considered talking to the police?" I had considered calling the police multiple times, but what would I tell them? That my neighbor had given me flowers and a photograph? That I thought he'd moved a glass? It all sounded trivial when I put it into words, but the cumulative effect was tearing me apart psychologically. I decided to install a small camera in my apartment, hidden on a bookshelf pointing toward the living room and kitchen. If David was really entering, I'd have proof. The first week caught nothing unusual. But during the second week, as I reviewed the footage, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The footage showed my apartment empty during the day, as expected, but around 2:30 p.m., while I was at work, a shadow moved briefly in front of the camera. It was too quick to see clearly, but someone had definitely been in my apartment. I reviewed the rest of the footage frame by frame. I could see small changes. A magazine shifted slightly, a chair pushed a few centimeters, a sofa cushion repositioned, but I could never capture a clear image of the intruder. I took the footage to the police. "Ma'am, this shows a blurry shadow," the officer who reviewed the video said. "We can't identify a specific person, and frankly, it could just be lighting changes. But look at the objects that moved." Objects could have moved for various reasons. Building vibrations, wind from open windows, even you might have moved them without remembering. "Officer, this man has been stalking me for months. Has he made direct threats? Has he tried to harm you physically?" "No, but..." "Ma'am, I understand you're scared, but what you've described doesn't constitute criminal behavior. Giving flowers and taking a photo in a public space aren't crimes, and this video doesn't show clear evidence of trespassing, so you're not going to do anything. We can talk to him, ask him to leave you alone, but without more concrete evidence, we can't arrest him." I left the police station feeling completely unprotected. David was being careful, staying just within legal boundaries while torturing me psychologically. That night, David knocked on my door again. "Amanda, I heard you went to the police." His voice came through the door. That really hurt me. I thought we were friends. How did he know I'd gone to the police? Had the officers spoken to him so quickly? "I just want you to know I won't hold it against you. I understand a woman living alone can get paranoid, but you're safe with me, Amanda. I'd never hurt you." His words, meant to be reassuring, only terrified me more. Over the next few weeks, David's behavior became more sophisticated and harder to prove. I started receiving phone calls at 3 a.m. with no one on the other end. Food deliveries I hadn't ordered arrived at my door. Magazine subscriptions appeared in my name. When I contacted these companies to cancel the orders or subscriptions, they told me the orders had been placed by phone by someone who knew specific personal information about me. My full address, phone number, and even references to conversations only David could have overheard. But when I tried to use this as evidence with the police, they told me anyone could have obtained that information from multiple sources. "Have you seen Mr. Miller make these calls?" the detective asked. "No, but do you have recordings of him ordering these things?" "No." "Then we don't have evidence linking him to these incidents." That's when David started showing up at places I went outside the building. I'd see him at the grocery store where I shopped, at the coffee shop where I had breakfast on weekends, at the park where I sometimes walked after work. Each time I confronted him, he had a perfectly reasonable explanation. "What a coincidence running into you here," he'd say with that smile that sent chills down my spine. "I needed to pick up some things too." Or, "Amanda, I'd never tried this place before, but the coffee's great." When I asked him directly if he was following me, he seemed genuinely offended. "Amanda, I live in the same area as you. It's natural we'd frequent the same places. You can't expect me to avoid every place you might go." Technically, he was right, but the frequency of these chance encounters was statistically improbable. I started documenting everything: dates, times, places I'd seen him, exact transcripts of our conversations. I took this documentation to a lawyer. "Ma'am, this describes a troubling pattern of behavior," the lawyer admitted. "But legally, it's very hard to prove harassment when the perpetrator is so careful. He can argue you live in the same building and area, making the encounters seem coincidental, so there's nothing I can do. You can request a restraining order, but based on the evidence you have, it's unlikely to be granted. Judges require evidence of direct threats or clearly criminal behavior." That conversation devastated me. David had carefully constructed a campaign of psychological terror that was subtle enough to avoid legal consequences, but invasive enough to ruin my quality of life. Over the next few months, my mental health deteriorated dramatically. I couldn't sleep well, I lost weight, and I lived in a constant state of anxiety. Every sound in the hallway made me jump. Every unknown phone call filled me with dread. David seemed to revel in my decline. His gifts continued, now often accompanied by notes commenting on my appearance. "You're looking very thin lately. I hope you're eating enough. Your concerned friend, D. I noticed dark circles under your beautiful eyes. Not sleeping well. If you need company during those long nights, I'm just down the hall. D." These notes demonstrated he was obsessively watching me, but when I took them to the police, they said they expressed concern and didn't constitute threats. Finally, in May, nearly 8 months after David moved into the building, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. Despite loving my apartment and having put so much effort into making it my home, I decided to move out. When I gave my 30-day notice to Mrs. Peterson, she seemed genuinely sad to see me go. "Amanda, I'm sorry we couldn't resolve the situation with David. You've been a wonderful tenant. Mrs. Peterson, he's been terrorizing me for months. I can't live like this. I understand, dear. But you should know, I never found concrete evidence he violated any building rules. Even Mrs. Peterson, who had been sympathetic initially, seemed to have come to believe I was overreacting. My final encounter with David was 3 days before I moved out. I was loading boxes into my car when he appeared suddenly beside me. "I heard you're moving," he said, his voice carrying an emotion I couldn't fully identify. "I'm really sad to see you go. David, you need to get professional help. What you've been doing isn't normal." "What have I been doing, Amanda?" "I've been a good neighbor. I've tried to be your friend. You know exactly what you've been doing." "No, I really don't. If I've done anything to upset you, it was unintentional." His ability to seem genuinely confused and hurt was terrifying. For a moment, he almost made me doubt my own perception of events. "I hope you're happy wherever you go," he continued, "but I want you to know you'll always have a friend in me. If you ever need anything." He stepped closer as if to hug me, and I instinctively backed away. "Don't touch me," I said firmly. "Of course. Sorry for invading your personal space," but as he walked away, he added, "Portland's not that big, Amanda. I'm sure we'll run into each other." Those words haunted me for weeks. Was it a veiled threat? A promise he'd continue stalking me even after I moved? I moved to an apartment across town, in a building with better security. For the first few months, every time I left my new home, I obsessively scanned for David's face in crowds. I constantly changed my routines, took different routes to work, and avoided my previous favorite places. About 6 months after moving, I started receiving letters at my new address. They were sent with no return address, but I immediately recognized David's neat, handwritten script. "Amanda, I hope you're settling into your new home. Portland really isn't as big as I thought. I've enjoyed exploring different neighborhoods. Your friend, D." The implication was clear. He had found out where I live now. I took the letters to the police, but again, they told me they didn't contain direct threats and it was impossible to prove who sent them without fingerprints or DNA. Over the next year, the letters arrived sporadically. Some contained photographs of locations near my new apartment, as if David was documenting his explorations of the area. Others simply expressed that he missed me and hoped we could reconnect soon. I never saw David in person again, but the feeling of being watched never fully left me. Every middle-aged man with brown hair made me jump. Every chance encounter with strangers filled me with paranoia. My professional life was also affected. My performance at work had declined during the months of harassment, and while it improved after moving, I never fully returned to my previous level of confidence and focus. Personal relationships were equally challenging. I had developed such hypervigilance that I found it hard to trust new men. When I finally started dating someone seriously, my boyfriend grew frustrated with my extreme safety precautions and reluctance to share details about my whereabouts. "Amanda, you're paranoid," he told me after I insisted on meeting in a public place for our 5th date. "Not every guy is dangerous." I couldn't explain that my paranoia wasn't irrational. It was an adaptive response to months of carefully orchestrated psychological terror. I sought therapy to deal with the trauma, but even my therapist initially seemed skeptical of the severity of what I'd experienced. "Sometimes, when we're stressed, we can interpret innocent behaviors as threatening," she said during our 3rd session. "I'm not imagining this," I protested. "I have all the notes, the photos, the documentation." "I'm not saying you're imagining it. I'm just suggesting you might be interpreting David's intentions as more sinister than they actually were." I eventually found a therapist who specialized in trauma and understood the psychologically devastating nature of invisible stalking, the kind that doesn't technically cross legal lines but destroys a victim's sense of safety. "What you experienced is called ambiguous stalking," she explained. "It's a form of psychological abuse where the perpetrator maintains plausible deniability while systematically undermining their victim's sense of safety." It was an immense relief to finally have a name for what I'd been through, and a professional who understood it wasn't my fault or my imagination. Though the letters eventually stopped arriving, the last one came about 2 years ago, I've never fully regained my sense of safety. I still obsessively check my locks, avoid predictable routines, and maintain a level of vigilance my friends find excessive. The most frustrating part of this entire experience is that David never faced consequences for his actions. Because he was so careful to stay within technically legal boundaries, the system never recognized him as the predator he was. I've thought a lot about whether I could have done something differently, whether I could have gathered better evidence, or found a way to prove what was happening. But the reality is that David was a sophisticated stalker who understood exactly how to manipulate the system to avoid accountability. Ultimately, I've come to accept that I'll never have justice in the traditional sense. David will never be arrested or prosecuted for the months of terror he inflicted on me. He'll never acknowledge or apologize for the harm he caused, but I've found other ways to process what I went through. I now work with organizations that help victims of stalking, particularly focusing on ambiguous cases like mine where legal evidence is hard to obtain. I've learned that my experience is far more common than I initially thought. There are countless women who have lived through similar situations, harassed by neighbors, colleagues, or acquaintances who are smart enough to avoid overtly criminal behavior, but systematically destroy their victims' peace of mind. The legal system, unfortunately, isn't well equipped to handle this kind of subtle psychological abuse. Police officers and judges are trained to identify explicit threats and overtly criminal behavior, not the careful campaign of intimidation David waged against me. This doesn't mean victims are entirely without resources. I've learned that documenting everything, even behaviors that seem minor, is crucial. Keeping a detailed record can help establish patterns that individually seem innocuous but collectively demonstrate systematic harassment. I've also learned the importance of trusting your gut. When something feels wrong, it probably is, even if you can't articulate exactly why. My initial mistake was trying to rationalize David's behavior, giving him the benefit of the doubt because he wasn't doing anything overtly threatening. To anyone who might be experiencing something similar, I want to emphasize that the psychological impact is real and valid even if you can't prove it legally. Gaslighting, making victims doubt their own perception, is a common tactic among sophisticated stalkers. If you're in a situation like this, seek professional support early. A therapist specializing in trauma can help you process what you're experiencing and develop coping strategies. Also, consider reaching out to victim support organizations, even if your situation hasn't escalated to physical violence. Change your routines regularly, vary your schedules, and don't be afraid to seem paranoid. Your emotional and psychological safety is more important than social niceties. Most importantly, believe in yourself. If something feels wrong, trust that feeling. Your intuition is a valuable survival tool, especially when dealing with someone skilled in psychological manipulation. David Miller stole nearly a year of my life and fundamentally changed how I navigate the world. Though I never had enough evidence to bring him to justice, I found some peace in using my experience to help others in similar situations. Stalking doesn't always look like explicit threats or physical violence. Sometimes it looks like a friendly neighbor who pays too much attention, who shows up in too many places, who knows too much about your life. Trust your gut, document everything, and seek support. Your experience is valid even if you can't prove it in a courtroom. And if David Miller is somehow reading this, I know exactly who you are and what you did. The fact that you were never arrested doesn't mean you were innocent. It just means you're a particularly skilled predator. I hope you eventually get the help you need, but more importantly, I hope no other woman has to endure the terror you inflicted on me. I never had concrete proof of everything David did, but I know what I lived through, and that's enough for me. My childhood in Greenfield, Ohio, was what most would consider normal. I lived with my parents, Robert and Linda Morrison, in a 2-story house on Maple Street, a quiet street lined with ancient oaks and well-kept gardens. My father worked as a manager at a local insurance company, and my mother was an elementary school teacher. We were a typical middle-class family in a small town where everyone knew each other. But even from a young age, there was something that always unsettled me about our family life, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was. Perhaps it was the way my parents sometimes exchanged glances when they thought I wasn't looking, or how certain conversations stopped abruptly when I entered a room. They were small, almost imperceptible details, but they accumulated in the mind of an observant child. I vividly remember our next-door neighbor, Mr. Thomas Hartwell, who lived alone in the red brick house right beside ours. He was a middle-aged man, perhaps in his 40s when I was 7 or 8 years old, with brown hair slightly graying at the temples and intense blue eyes that seemed to study everything around him with an uncomfortable intensity. Mr. Hartwell had always been part of the landscape of my childhood. He had lived in that house since before I was born, my parents told me, and he was one of those neighbors who kept his property impeccable but rarely interacted socially with other residents on the street. What struck me most about Mr. Hartwell was his behavior toward our family, and particularly toward me. While he was polite but distant with other neighbors, with us he seemed to have a strange familiarity. He would appear in our front yard on Saturday mornings when my father was mowing the lawn, and they would talk in low voices for long periods. Sometimes I saw them gesturing intensely as if discussing something important. "What do Dad and Mr. Hartwell talk about?" I asked my mother one day while watching through the kitchen window. "Grown-up things, sweetheart," my mother replied, but there was something tense in her voice. "Neighborhood matters." But even at 8 years old, I knew their conversations weren't about the neighborhood. There was an intimacy in the way they leaned toward each other, an urgency in their gestures that suggested far more personal and complicated discussions. Mr. Hartwell also showed a particular interest in me that I found both flattering and unsettling. When I played in the front yard, I often caught him watching me from his window. When he saw me looking, he would wave and smile, but there was something in that smile that made me uneasy. On special occasions like my birthday, or when I got good grades, Mr. Hartwell would show up at our door with gifts. They weren't ordinary gifts an adult neighbor might give to their neighbor's daughter. They were carefully chosen, books that perfectly matched my interests, toys I knew I wanted, clothes that fit me perfectly. How does Mr. Hartwell know what books I like? I asked my mother after he gave me a series of young adult mystery novels I had been dying to read. He's very observant, she replied, but she avoided my gaze while folding laundry. He pays attention to what you say. But I knew I had never talked to Mr. Hartwell about my reading preferences. I rarely spoke to him at all. When I turned 10, I began noticing other strange patterns. Mr. Hartwell seemed to know details about my school life that he had no way of knowing. When I sprained my ankle during a softball game, he showed up the next day asking specifically about my injury. When I had trouble with a particular teacher, he made subtle comments that suggested he knew exactly what was happening in my classroom. I heard Mrs. Patterson can be pretty strict, he said one afternoon while I was picking up the mail. I hope she's not being too hard on you. I had never mentioned Mrs. Patterson in his presence, and my parents weren't the type to discuss my school matters with neighbors. The dynamic between my parents and Mr. Hartwell also continued to evolve in ways I found disturbing. My father, typically a confident and straightforward man, became noticeably tense and submissive when Mr. Hartwell was around. It was as if there was an invisible hierarchy between them that I couldn't understand. One night, when I was 11, I woke up to use the bathroom and heard intense voices coming from the living room. I recognized my parents' voices and Mr. Hartwell's. They were speaking in urgent whispers, but occasionally someone raised their voice enough for me to catch snippets of the conversation. "It's not fair to her," I heard my mother say. "You don't have a choice in this," Mr. Hartwell's voice replied, with a tone I had never heard before. It was authoritative, almost threatening. Just a child," my mother continued, and I could detect tears in her voice. "My right?" Mr. Hartwell's voice rose slightly before he evidently reminded himself to whisper. I stood frozen in the hallway, trying to process what I was hearing. Why was Mr. Hartwell in our house so late at night? What were they talking about that involved his right and affected me? As the conversation grew more heated, I heard footsteps approaching the hallway, so I ran back to my room and climbed into bed, pretending to sleep. Minutes later, I heard the front door close quietly, followed by my parents' footsteps climbing the stairs. The next morning at breakfast, the atmosphere in the house was tense. My mother had puffy eyes, as if she had been crying, and my father seemed distracted and worried. "Is everything okay?" I asked, looking between the two of them. "Of course, sweetheart," my mother replied quickly, but her smile was forced. "Just grown-up matters." "Did Mr. Hartwell come over last night?" I asked, watching their reactions carefully. My parents exchanged a quick, meaningful glance. "Why would you ask that?" my father said, his voice sharper than usual. "I thought I heard voices," I replied innocently. "You must have been dreaming," my mother said, but there was a hardness in her tone that told me not to press further. As I grew older, these strange incidents continued and intensified. Mr. Hartwell seemed to have an almost supernatural knowledge of every aspect of my life. He knew when I had major exams, when I had arguments with friends, when I was going through typical teenage struggles. More disturbingly, he began offering specific, detailed advice about my personal problems. Advice that was eerily appropriate and helpful. "I've noticed you've seemed worried lately," he said one afternoon when I was 13 and dealing with social drama at school. "Friendship issues at your age can be tough. Have you considered talking directly to Sarah about what's bothering you?" Sarah was my best friend, and we had had a fight I hadn't discussed with anyone except my parents. How did Mr. Hartwell know about Sarah, let alone our specific dispute? How do you know about Sarah? I asked directly. Your mother mentioned you were having some social challenges, he replied smoothly. I just wanted to help. But when I asked my mother that night if she had talked to Mr. Hartwell about my friendship with Sarah, she seemed genuinely confused. I don't recall discussing that with him, she said, frowning. Why do you ask? These kinds of discrepancies began to pile up. Mr. Hartwell knew things my parents insisted they hadn't shared with him. Yet at the same time, my parents continued to maintain an oddly close relationship with him, one that seemed to involve far more communication than they admitted. When I entered high school, my relationship with Mr. Hartwell became even more complex and unsettling. He was now a man of about 50, still handsome in a distinguished way, with fully graying temples and wrinkles that suggested both intelligence and chronic concern. His knowledge of my life had become so detailed and accurate that I began to actively suspect he was spying on me somehow. He knew about my grades before report cards even arrived home. He knew about my romantic interests before I confided them to my parents. He knew about conflicts with teachers, my weekend plans, books I had checked out from the library. Congratulations on getting the lead role in the school play, he said one morning as he picked up his newspaper from his driveway. The auditions had been the previous day, and the results hadn't been publicly announced yet. I hadn't even had a chance to tell my parents. How did you know that? I asked, feeling both thrilled by the recognition and disturbed by his knowledge. Your mother was so excited when she told me last night, he replied, with that smile I had learned to distrust. But when I got home that afternoon and told my parents about my role in the play, their reactions of surprise and joy seemed completely genuine. Paula, that's wonderful, my mother exclaimed, hugging me. When did you find out? This morning, I replied, watching her face carefully. Mr. Hartwell said you already knew. My mother looked confused. I didn't talk to Thomas about any play. There must have been some misunderstanding. These misunderstandings became so frequent that I started keeping a journal, documenting every instance where Mr. Hartwell demonstrated knowledge he shouldn't have had. The pattern was undeniable. He knew about my life in a level of detail that was impossible unless he was actively gathering information about me. But how? And more importantly, why? During my sophomore year of high school, I began asking more direct and persistent questions. One night, after Mr. Hartwell had made another impossibly informed comment about my school life, I confronted my parents. There's something weird about Mr. Hartwell, I declared during dinner. He knows things about me he shouldn't know. And you two act strange whenever he's around. My parents exchanged that look I'd been seeing my whole life, a look laden with secret meaning and shared anxiety. Paula, Mr. Hartwell is just a good neighbor who cares about you, my father said, but his voice lacked conviction. Why would he care so much about me? He doesn't have kids of his own. We don't have a special relationship with him. It's weird. Sometimes adults without children enjoy looking out for the kids in their community, my mother offered. But I could see even she wasn't satisfied with this explanation. Mom, he knows about my life in ways that aren't normal. He knew about my role in the play before you did. He knew about my fight with Sarah. He knew I failed my math test before I told you. This isn't looking out for the community. This is... I don't know what it is, but it's not normal. My father dropped his fork, and the sound echoed in the sudden silence of the kitchen. Paula, my mother said softly, Mr. Hartwell is complicated. There are things about him, about our relationship with him, that you wouldn't understand. Then explain it to me, I demanded. I'm 16 years old. I'm not a child. Some things are better left unexplained, my father said with finality. Just trust that we're handling the situation. What situation? I don't even know what you're talking about. And that's for the best, my mother concluded, and I could see the conversation was over. But I wasn't going to let the matter drop. That night, after my parents went to sleep, I snuck out of the house and went to Mr. Hartwell's backyard. His house was dark, except for a light in what I knew was his study. I could see a silhouette moving behind the curtains. I crept closer to the window, staying in the shadows, and tried to peer inside. What I saw chilled me to the bone. The walls of Mr. Hartwell's study were covered in photographs, hundreds of photographs, and they were all of me. There were photos of me at different ages, as a toddler playing in our yard, as an elementary schooler walking to the bus, as a young teenager leaving school, at school plays, at sports events. Some of the photos seemed to have been taken from a distance with a telephoto lens. Others seemed more casual, as if taken during normal interactions. But they all had one thing in common. I was the sole subject. There were no photos of my parents, no other neighborhood kids, no normal family events. Just me, obsessively documented over the years. On his desk, I could see what looked like files or folders, all labeled with what appeared to be my name. There were papers scattered about, but I couldn't read the text from my position outside the window. Mr. Hartwell was sitting at his desk, writing in what seemed to be a journal or notebook. Occasionally, he would get up and study one of the photographs on the wall before returning to his writing. I stood frozen, watching for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The implication of what I was seeing was terrifying. This man had been obsessively documenting my life for years, possibly since I was born. When I finally returned home, trembling from both cold and shock, I couldn't sleep. My mind raced with questions. How long had Mr. Hartwell been obsessed with me? Did my parents know about his collection of photographs? Was that why they acted so strange around him? The next day, I confronted my parents directly about what I had seen. "I need you to tell me the truth," I declared at breakfast, my voice shaking with pent-up emotion. "Last night, I saw Mr. Hartwell's study. It's filled with photographs of me, hundreds of them." My parents' reaction was immediate and dramatic. My mother dropped her coffee mug, spilling liquid all over the table. My father went completely pale. "You went to his house," my father demanded, standing abruptly from the table. "I didn't go inside. I just looked through the window. Dad, there were photos of me all over the walls, from when I was little to now. Why does Mr. Hartwell have all those photos of me?" My parents looked at each other, and in that glance I saw real fear. "Paula," my mother said slowly, "you need to promise me you won't go near Mr. Hartwell's house again. Ever. Why? What's going on? Just promise me," my father insisted, and there was an urgency in his voice I had never heard before. "Not until you tell me what's happening." "He has photos of me. That's weird and scary, and you're acting like it's normal." "It's not normal," my mother finally admitted, tears starting to form in her eyes. "Nothing about this situation is normal." "Then why are you letting it happen?" "Because we don't have a choice," my father said, and there was a defeat in his voice that scared me more than anything I had seen before. That conversation marked a turning point in my relationship with my parents. For the first time in my life, they had admitted that something was fundamentally wrong with the situation with Mr. Hartwell, but they refused to explain why they felt powerless to do anything about it. Over the next few weeks, I watched their interactions with Mr. Hartwell more closely. What I saw confirmed my suspicions that there were power dynamics at play that I didn't understand. Mr. Hartwell visited our house at least twice a week, always in the evenings after I'd finished my homework. These visits followed a pattern. He would arrive around 8, talk with my parents in the living room for about an hour, and then leave. The conversations always stopped when I appeared, and the atmosphere in the house after his visits was invariably tense. One night, I decided to eavesdrop more systematically. I pretended to go to my room to study, but instead I sat at the top of the stairs where I could hear snippets of their conversations. "She's asking too many questions," I heard my mother say. "That was inevitable," Mr. Hartwell replied. "She's growing up." "But that doesn't change anything. Thomas, this has to stop," my father said, and I could hear the strain in his voice. "It's not healthy for any of us, especially her. Robert, we've had this arrangement for 16 years. You're not going to decide unilaterally that it has to stop now." She saw the photographs. My mother's voice rose. "Do you know how traumatic that must have been for her?" "I should have been more careful with the curtains," Mr. Hartwell admitted, but there was no remorse in his voice. "But her curiosity is understandable. She's my—" "Don't say it," my father interrupted sharply. "Not here." "Robert, denying reality doesn't change it." "The reality," my mother said bitterly, "is that this situation is unsustainable. Paula is old enough now to start connecting the dots." "What dots?" Mr. Hartwell asked, and there was something dangerous in his tone. There was a long silence before my father responded. "She started asking why she doesn't have baby photos." My blood ran cold. It was true. I had noticed several months earlier that, unlike most families, we didn't have photo albums from my early childhood. When I asked my parents about it, they said the photos had been lost in a basement flood before I was old enough to remember. "And what did you tell her?" Mr. Hartwell's voice was now tense. "The same thing we always have. That they were lost. Good. Stick to that story." "Thomas," my mother said, and her voice broke. "She deserves to know the truth." "The truth," he replied, "would destroy her. And it would destroy all of us. Do you really want that?" "Sometimes I wonder if it wouldn't be better," my father began. "Don't finish that sentence," Mr. Hartwell said, and there was a clear threat in his voice. "Remember what's at stake here. For all of us." After that, the conversation became too quiet for me to hear, but I had heard enough to know there were monumental secrets about my life that had been kept hidden for years. That night, I couldn't sleep, processing the implications of what I had overheard. Why didn't I have baby photos? Why did Mr. Hartwell refer to some kind of arrangement that had been in place for 16 years, exactly as long as I had been alive? What truth would destroy me? The next day, I decided to do my own investigation. While my parents were at work, I meticulously searched every photo album, every storage box, every corner of our house where important documents might be kept. In a box in the attic, I found something that took my breath away, my original birth certificate. But there was something strange about it. The father's name was blank, and there was evidence that something had been erased or altered on the document. I also found legal documents I didn't fully understand, but that seemed related to adoption or guardianship. The names on the documents included my parents, but also someone else, Thomas J. Hartwell. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might faint. Why was Mr. Hartwell's name on legal documents related to me? That night, armed with what I had found, I confronted my parents again. "I found documents in the attic," I declared, placing the papers on the kitchen table. "I want to know what they mean." My parents looked at the documents, and I saw pure horror on their faces. "Paula," my mother said, her voice barely a whisper, "you shouldn't have seen these." But I did, and I want answers. Real ones this time. My father sat down heavily, suddenly looking much older than his 45 years. "Linda," he said to my mother, "I think it's time." "Robert, you know what he said." "I don't care what he said anymore." She deserves to know. My mother began to cry but nodded. "Paula," my father began, "the situation with Thomas, with Mr. Hartwell, is complicated in ways you never imagined. Explain it to me," I demanded, sitting across from them. "Thomas Hartwell he's your biological father." The words hit like a lightning bolt. For a moment, I couldn't process what he had said. "What?" I whispered. "Your biological mother was very young when she got pregnant," my father continued. "She was the daughter of some friends of ours. Thomas he was considerably older than her. She couldn't raise you," my mother added through her tears. "And Thomas, for reasons we never fully understood, didn't want to raise you himself. But he also didn't want to lose you completely. So you adopted me?" "Yes. But Thomas insisted on specific terms." "What kind of terms?" My parents exchanged another of those loaded glances. "He wanted to be able to be part of your life. to watch you grow up, to be involved in major decisions. Essentially, he wanted all the benefits of being your father without any of the actual responsibilities. And you agreed to that. We didn't have a choice, my mother said bitterly. Thomas has influence, money, legal connections. He threatened to take us to court, to take you away from us if we didn't agree to his arrangement. So, for 16 years, you've been blackmailed, my father finished. Yes. The days following this revelation were the hardest of my life up to that point. Everything I thought I knew about my family, my identity, my childhood, had been an elaborate lie constructed to satisfy the desires of a man who had been too cowardly to raise me himself, but too selfish to let me go. I began to reinterpret all my memories through this new lens. Mr. Hartwell's unusual interest in my life now made sense, but in the most disturbing way possible. He wasn't a creepy neighbor obsessed with me. He was my biological father, who had structured my entire life so he could watch me in secret. The photographs in his study weren't evidence of random stalker behavior. They were the collection of a father who had chosen to document his daughter's childhood from a distance rather than participate in it. His perfectly chosen gifts, his knowledge of my school life, his ability to offer appropriate advice about my problems. It all made sense now. He had been receiving detailed information about my life from my parents as part of their arrangement. But understanding the reasons behind the behavior didn't make it less traumatic. If anything, it made it worse. This man had chosen to be an absent father, while simultaneously denying my adoptive parents the freedom to raise me without his constant interference. What else do I need to know? I asked my parents during another tense late-night conversation. Thomas insisted on approving major decisions, my father admitted. Where you went to school, what activities you could do, even which doctors you could see. He controlled my medical care. He insisted on being informed about all your medical care. He wanted copies of all medical records, school reports, teacher evaluations. The invasion of privacy was overwhelming. This man had had access to every intimate detail of my life for 16 years, all while pretending to be merely a concerned neighbor. Why didn't you ever tell me the truth? I asked. Thomas made us sign legal agreements, my mother explained. If we ever revealed the truth to you without his permission, he could take us to court and potentially take you away from us. But what if I found out the truth on my own? That was a gray area in the agreements, my father admitted. But Thomas always made it clear that any revelation of the truth would have consequences. What kind of consequences? My parents looked at each other with obvious fear. Thomas documented situations that could be interpreted as neglect on our part, my mother said slowly. Minor things that all parents experience, but that could look problematic if presented a certain way in court. He's been blackmailing you with false accusations of neglect? Not exactly false, my father said, but certainly exaggerated and taken out of context. The full picture was finally coming into focus, and it was more sinister than I had imagined. Thomas Hartwell had constructed an elaborate system of control and manipulation that allowed him to maintain power over our entire family for years. What does he know about me finding out the truth? I asked. He doesn't know yet, my mother said, but he'll figure it out eventually. We can't hide your changed behavior from him for long. So what happens when he finds out? We don't know, my father admitted. This is uncharted territory. That night, I decided I needed to confront Thomas Hartwell directly. I had questions only he could answer, and I refused to keep living in this state of secrecy and uncertainty. The next morning, while my parents were at work, I went to his house and knocked on the door. Thomas opened the door, and for the first time in my life, I looked at him knowing the truth about who he was. It was strange to see him now, searching for physical similarities I had been conditioned not to notice. We had the same blue eyes, the same nose shape, the same hair color. "Paula," he said, and there was genuine surprise in his voice. "What brings you here?" "I think you know why I'm here," I replied, holding my ground despite my heart pounding furiously. His expression shifted, becoming more guarded. "Why don't you come in?" he said finally. "I think we need to talk." I stepped into Mr. Hartwell's house for the first time in my life. The interior was exactly as I had imagined. Neat, masculine, and filled with objects that suggested a comfortable but solitary life. He led me to his study, the same room where I had seen the photographs. Now, looking at them up close, I could see the full progression of my life documented on the walls. It was both fascinating and deeply unsettling. "So, you know," he said, sitting behind his desk, "I know you're my biological father. I know about the legal agreements. I know you've been controlling my life from the shadows for 16 years. "It's more complicated than you understand," he replied. "Then explain it to me." Thomas leaned back in his chair, studying me with an intensity I found uncomfortable. The implications of that age difference hit me like a punch to the stomach. The conversation with Thomas had answered some questions but created many more. His reference to dangerous complications in his life deeply unsettled me. What exactly was he protecting me from? Or was he simply inventing justifications for his selfish behavior? Over the next few weeks, I began my own investigation into Thomas Hartwell. If I was going to fully understand the situation my family had been trapped in for years, I needed to know more about who this man really was. I started with basic internet searches. Thomas Hartwell had a minimal online presence, which in itself was suspicious for someone of his age and apparent socioeconomic status. He had no social media profiles, few mentions in professional directories, and no significant presence in search engines. What I could find was intriguing. He had been mentioned briefly in some local newspaper articles from years earlier, always in the context of real estate transactions or minor business developments. He seemed to have substantial financial resources, but the source of his wealth was unclear. One afternoon, while researching at the local library, I found a more substantial reference. In a 15-year-old newspaper article, Thomas Hartwell was mentioned as part of a federal investigation into suspicious financial operations. The article didn't provide many details, but it suggested he had been questioned as part of a broader investigation into money laundering. He had never been charged with any crime, but his name had appeared in court documents as an associate of individuals who were later convicted of financial crimes. This information shed an entirely new light on his behavior toward my family. If Thomas had been involved in criminal activities, or at least investigated for them, then his insistence on maintaining official distance from me while retaining control could have been a strategy to protect himself legally. If something went wrong in his professional life, he could claim he had no direct family responsibilities. But if he wanted to exert parental control, he could use his financial and legal power to do so through my adoptive parents. I brought this information to my parents, who were horrified but not surprised. "Oh, we always knew there was more to this situation," my mother admitted. Thomas never fully explained why the arrangements had to be so elaborate. "Did you know about the federal investigations?" "We had suspicions," my father said. "There have been times when Thomas seemed under unusual stress, periods where he was particularly paranoid about documentation and legal procedures." "Did he ever ask you to lie for him or cover anything up?" My parents exchanged a meaningful glance. "There have been times," my mother admitted slowly, "when Thomas asked us not to mention certain visits of his, or not to talk about specific conversations we'd had with him." "What kind of conversations?" "Sometimes he'd come with very specific questions about our finances, about any contact we might have had with government agencies, about whether anyone had been asking questions about him." The picture was becoming clearer. Thomas hadn't just been using my family to satisfy his emotional needs as an absent father. He had also been using us as a kind of early warning system for any investigations or legal scrutiny he might be facing. Do you think he's still involved in illegal activities? I asked. Honestly, we don't know, my father said. But his level of control over our lives and his paranoia about secrecy suggests there's definitely something he's trying to hide. That night, I decided I needed more information directly from Thomas. It was risky to confront him, but I felt I had a right to fully understand what kind of situation my family had been entangled in. I went back to his house, this time unannounced. When I knocked on the door, there was no answer, but I could see lights on inside. I walked around the house and peered through the study window. Thomas was there, but he wasn't alone. There was another man with him, someone I didn't recognize. They were hunched over the desk, reviewing what looked like financial or legal documents. The conversation seemed intense, and both men looked stressed. As I watched, I saw Thomas pull a small safe from under his desk. He opened it and removed what appeared to be stacks of cash. He handed the money to the other man, who counted it quickly before tucking it into a briefcase. The two men continued talking for several more minutes, but from my position, I couldn't hear the conversation. Finally, the visitors stood to leave. They shook hands, but the atmosphere was tense, not friendly. As the visitor headed toward the front door, I hid behind a large bush in the backyard. I could see him clearly as he walked to his car, a sleek black sedan with plates I couldn't read in the dark. After the man left, I peered back into the study window. Thomas was returning the safe to its hiding place, but he was also packing papers into a separate briefcase. His movements were hurried, almost frantic. It was clear something significant had happened during that meeting, something that had put Thomas in a state of considerable agitation. The next day, I noticed Thomas behaving differently during his usual visit to our house. He was more tense than usual, and his conversations with my parents were more urgent and whispered. After he left, I confronted my parents about what I had witnessed. "Have you ever seen Thomas with large amounts of cash?" I asked. "Why would you ask that?" My father replied, immediately becoming defensive. I told them about what I had seen the previous night. "Paula," my mother said seriously, "you need to stay away from Thomas when he has visitors. If he's involved in something dangerous, we don't want you to be seen as a witness." "So, you admit he might be involved in criminal activities?" "We admit there are aspects of Thomas's life we don't understand, and that concern us," my father said carefully. "And you've been protecting him all these years?" "We haven't been protecting him," my mother protested. "We've been protecting you." Thomas made it very clear that if we ever expose him or defy him, the consequences for our family would be severe. "What kind of consequences?" "The kind that are better left unspecified," my father said with finality. The events of the next few weeks moved rapidly toward a confrontation that would change everything for our family. Thomas had become increasingly paranoid and controlling, visiting our house almost daily and asking detailed questions about any contact we might have had with strangers. One night, while pretending to sleep, I overheard another urgent conversation between Thomas and my parents in the living room. "You need to understand that the situation has become more complicated," Thomas was saying. "There have been developments that require us to take additional precautions." "What kind of developments?" my father asked. "The kind that means our current arrangement might need to change." "Change how?" My mother's voice was filled with alarm. "It may be necessary for Paula to relocate temporarily. Somewhere, she's completely out of reach of any potential investigations." "Absolutely not," my father declared. "We're not going to let you use our daughter as a human shield for whatever legal troubles you're facing." "Robert," Thomas said, and his voice carried a clear threat, "I don't think you understand the gravity of this situation. This isn't a request. She's our daughter," my mother said firmly. "We've followed your rules for 16 years, but we're not going to let you put her in danger." "Danger?" Thomas's voice turned cold. "The only danger here comes from defying me. Do you really want to find out what happens when I stop being cooperative with this arrangement?" "What are you going to do, Thomas?" "Report us for child neglect. Paul is 16. any court can see she's been well cared for. There are other ways to destroy a family, Robert. Other accusations that can be made. Other investigations that can be initiated. The implied threat was clear. Thomas didn't just have power over us through the custody agreements. He had the power to destroy my parents in ways that went beyond taking me away from them. The next day, I decided I had heard enough. It was time for someone to challenge Thomas's control. And if my parents couldn't do it because of the threats they faced, then it would have to be me. I went straight to his house and knocked on the door with determination. "We need to talk," I declared, when he opened the door. "Paula, this isn't a good time." "I don't care if it's a good time anymore. This ends now." Thomas looked at me for a long moment, then stepped aside to let me in. "All right," he said finally. "I think it's time you had the full truth." He led me back to the study, but this time he went straight to the safe I had seen him use days earlier. He opened it and pulled out a thick folder. "Your biological mother," he began, "wasn't just a minor when we had our relationship. Her father was also a very powerful and dangerous man." "What do you mean?" "He was the head of a criminal organization. When he found out about our relationship and your pregnancy, he wasn't pleased." Thomas opened the folder and showed me photographs and documents. He gave me two options: disappear permanently, or find a way to raise the daughter I had created with his daughter without officially involving either of our names. The photographs showed dangerous-looking men, documents that appeared to be financial agreements, and what looked like written threats. "So, this whole arrangement with my parents was to protect you from criminals." "To protect all of us," Thomas corrected. "If your biological grandfather found out I was openly raising his granddaughter, or if any authorities officially connected my name to you, both you and I would be in danger." "Why should I believe you?" "Because now that you're 16 and asking questions, that danger has become real again." Thomas showed me more documents from the folder. "I've been receiving inquiries about you. People asking about a teenage girl who might be related to me. Your grandfather never forgot, and he never forgave, so the men you've been meeting, the money you've been paying, protection payments, bribes, attempts to keep information about you out of the wrong hands, and the threat to relocate me. It may be necessary. If the situation deteriorates further, you'll need to be somewhere they can't find you." As Thomas spoke, the pieces finally fell into place. All the secrecy, all the paranoia, all the threats against my parents. It had all been an elaborate protection operation against what sounded like a vengeful criminal organization. "Why didn't you tell me this from the start?" I asked. "Because I hoped it would never be necessary. I hoped you could grow up normally without ever knowing about these complications, but now it's necessary. Now that you're asking questions and digging into my life, yes. Your curiosity has created exposure we can't afford." Thomas closed the folder and looked at me directly. "Paula, I need you to understand that everything we've done, all the secrets, all the lies, all the manipulation, has been to keep you alive. And what happens now? Now you need to decide if you can live with this knowledge, or if we need to take more drastic measures to ensure your safety." As I left Thomas's house that afternoon, my mind was reeling. I had come seeking confrontation and clarity, but I had found something far more complex and terrifying. If Thomas was telling the truth, then every adult in my life had been participating in a massive cover-up operation for years, not to control or manipulate me, but to protect me from dangers I didn't even know existed. But if he was lying, then he was an even more sophisticated manipulator than I had thought, capable of crafting elaborate narratives to justify years of abusive and controlling behavior. The truth, I realized, might lie somewhere in between, and now that I had opened this Pandora's box, there was no way to close it again. That night, when I told my parents about my conversation with Thomas, their reactions confirmed my worst fears. "So it's true," my mother whispered. "All this time I thought maybe he was exaggerating the danger. So what do we do?" "Now," my mother said sadly, We do what we should have done years ago. We find a way to get you out of this situation completely. But Thomas said that would be dangerous. Thomas has said a lot of things over the years, my father interrupted. It's time we decide for ourselves what's true and what's manipulation. That night, for the first time since I had discovered the truth about my identity, I felt a glimmer of hope. My family was finally ready to challenge Thomas's control, no matter the consequences. But I also knew we were stepping into dangerous and uncharted territory, and that no matter what happened next, my life would never be the same. 6 months have passed since that night, and our family finally found the courage to break the chains Thomas Hartwell had forged around us for so many years. Working with a lawyer who specialized in cases of family manipulation, we were able to uncover that many of Thomas's legal threats had been exaggerated or entirely fabricated. His documents about supposed neglect on my parents' part were mostly misinterpreted statements and normal parenting situations presented maliciously. More importantly, when we investigated the claims about my biological grandfather and criminal organizations, we found those stories were also largely fabricated. Today, I no longer live with the constant fear that defined my teenage years. Thomas no longer has contact with our family, and while the legal process to formalize this was complicated, we are finally free to live our lives without his interference. I've chosen to keep the Morrison surname. Robert and Linda are my true parents in every way that matters, and I have no interest in claiming a connection to a man who chose control over love, secrecy over honesty, and his own convenience over the well-being of his daughter. The experience taught me that family secrets, no matter how well-intentioned they may seem, have the power to poison relationships and steal autonomy from the people they're supposed to protect. But I also learned that the truth, no matter how painful or complicated, is always preferable to living a lie, and that real families, families chosen and built on mutual love and respect, are stronger than any biological connection distorted by manipulation and control. Thomas Hartwell may have been my biological father, but he was never truly my dad. That distinction belongs to Robert Morrison, the man who chose to love and protect me without a hidden agenda, without manipulative control, and without secrets that poisoned our bond. And that, finally, is all I needed to know. What I'm about to tell you happened 5 years ago, but I still can't get it out of my mind. Every time I hear the sound of a moving truck in my current neighborhood, my skin crawls, and I'm transported back to those months of terror I lived through on Millfield Avenue, in a quiet Ohio suburb. Back then, I was 29 years old and had just bought my first house. It was a beautiful 2-story property on a tree-lined street, with friendly neighbors and a perfect family-friendly atmosphere for a single woman working from home as a freelance graphic designer. The house at number 45 Millfield Avenue had become my sanctuary, my safe place in the world. The property next door, number 47, had been empty for the 6 months I'd been living there. According to Mrs. Peterson, my neighbor on the other side, the house had belonged to an elderly couple who had moved to a retirement home. It was a house similar to mine, but with a larger garden and windows that seemed to stare directly into my backyard. It was a Tuesday in October when I saw the moving truck parked in front of number 47. From the window of my second-floor office, I watched with curiosity as the workers unloaded furniture and boxes. It was an odd move. Everything seemed brand new, as if someone had bought it all at once, rather than moving in with possessions accumulated over years. I didn't see the new owner that first day, only the moving workers doing their job in silent efficiency. But I did notice something that caught my attention. They had installed security cameras. A lot of security cameras. I could see at least 4 from my window, all pointing in different directions, including one that seemed to be aimed directly at my property. That night, while preparing dinner, I decided to bake a welcome cake for my new neighbor. It was something my mother had always done when we were kids and new neighbors arrived. I thought it would be a friendly way to introduce myself and establish a good relationship from the start. The next afternoon, with the cake in my hands, I walked to number 47 and rang the doorbell. The door had a new peephole that looked like one of those with a 180-degree view. I waited a moment, but there was no response. I tried ringing again, and this time I heard movement inside the house. "Who is it?" a male voice asked from the other side of the door. "I'm Juana, your neighbor from 45. I brought you a welcome cake." There was a long pause before I heard the sound of multiple locks being undone. The door opened just a few inches, held in place by a security chain. Through the crack, I could see part of a face, a piercing green eye, part of a well-groomed beard, and skin that looked like it hadn't seen much sun lately. "That wasn't necessary," the voice said, with an accent I couldn't quite place. "But thank you." I extended the cake toward the door. "Can I pass it to you?" "I hope you like chocolate." The door closed for a moment. I heard the chain being removed, and then it opened just enough for an arm to reach out and take the cake. It was a slender but muscular arm, and I noticed it had several tattoos that looked like numbers or some kind of code. "I'm Marcus," the voice said. "Marcus Kellerman." "Nice to meet you, Marcus. If you need anything or have questions about the neighborhood, don't hesitate to knock on my door." "I'll keep that in mind," he replied, and I could feel him watching me through the crack in the door, though I couldn't see his full face. The door closed without further exchange, and I heard the sound of multiple locks being secured again. As I walked back to my house, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been off about that interaction. It wasn't just the obviously excessive door security or the fact that he hadn't wanted to open it fully. There was something in his voice, in the way he had paused before responding, that made me uneasy. That night, while working on my computer, I occasionally glanced out the window toward Marcus's house. The lights were on in several rooms, and I could see shadows moving behind the curtains. But what struck me most was that the lights seemed to turn on and off in patterns. They went on and off in regular sequences, as if he were following some highly specific routine. At 11:47 p.m. exactly, all the lights in the house went out simultaneously, as if there were a master switch. I found it odd that someone would be so precise with their sleep schedule, especially on their first night in a new house. Over the next few weeks, I began noticing patterns in Marcus's behavior that seemed increasingly strange. Working from home gave me a privileged view of neighborhood activities, and Marcus definitely didn't follow normal routines. First, there was the issue of his schedule. Marcus seemed completely nocturnal. I never saw him during the day, but at night his house became a hub of activity. The lights turned on at exactly 8:30 p.m. every night, always following the same pattern. First the kitchen, then the living room, then what seemed to be an office on the second floor, and finally the bedroom. At 11:47 p.m., like clockwork, everything turned off. Second, he had visitors, but not the kind of visitors you'd expect someone who just moved to a suburban neighborhood to have. The cars that arrived at his house were always dark sedans with tinted windows, and the visits always happened late at night, usually between 9:30 and 10:30 p.m. The strangest part was that these visits lasted exactly 15 minutes. I timed several of them, and without fail, the visitors left after precisely 15 minutes. What kind of social or business meeting lasts exactly 15 minutes every single time? Then there was the matter of deliveries. Marcus received packages almost every day, but he never received them in person. They were left at his door, and a few minutes later, he'd quickly step out, grab them, and go back inside. On the few occasions I caught a glimpse of him during these quick outings, he always wore a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes and a face mask, even before masks became common due to the pandemic. One afternoon, while watering my plants in the backyard, I accidentally dropped the hose, and the water splashed toward the fence separating our properties. As I went to pick it up, I noticed something that chilled me. There were small holes in the fence, holes that had clearly been drilled from Marcus's side, offering a perfect view of my backyard and the rear windows of my house. That night, I couldn't sleep. The thought that someone might be watching me through those holes filled me with an anxiety I had never felt before. I decided to conduct an experiment. Over the next few days, I deliberately varied my routines. Instead of working in my second-floor office, I worked in the kitchen. Instead of watering my plants in the afternoon, I did it in the morning. And Marcus seemed to notice these changes. The light patterns in his house began to shift as well, always in ways that suggested he was tracking my new routine. When I worked in the kitchen, I noticed lights on in the room of his house with the best view of my kitchen. When I watered the plants in the morning, that afternoon I found new holes in the fence, positioned to observe the area where I had been working. That's when I decided to talk to Mrs. Peterson about Marcus. "Oh, the new man," Mrs. Peterson said when I asked if she had interacted with him. "Very odd, that one. My husband tried to introduce himself last week, but he didn't even open the door." "Have you noticed anything unusual about his behavior?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Well, now that you mention it, yes. My grandkids were visiting last weekend, and when they were playing in the front yard, I noticed a man in one of the upstairs windows of that house, watching them with binoculars." My blood ran cold. "With binoculars?" "Yes, dear. And when the kids realized he was watching them and pointed at him, he immediately closed the curtains. I didn't like it one bit. Did you mention it to anyone?" "I told my husband, but he said maybe he was just birdwatching or something. But honestly, Juana, I didn't like the feeling it gave me." That conversation confirmed my worst suspicions. Marcus wasn't just an antisocial neighbor. He was actively watching people in the neighborhood, and there was something about his behavior that even an elderly woman like Mrs. Peterson found unsettling. I decided to start my own system of documentation. I bought a small camera and began photographing Marcus's light patterns, the schedules of his visitors, and any other unusual behavior I observed. If something happened, I wanted to have evidence. What I didn't expect was how quickly Marcus would realize I was watching him too. It was mid-November when things started to escalate. One morning, while making coffee in my kitchen, I noticed something that made me spill the hot mug on my hands in shock. There was a photograph taped to the outside of my kitchen's rear window. It was a photograph of me. A photograph that had been taken from the backyard, showing me working at my computer at the kitchen table. But the most terrifying part was the angle. It had been taken from a position that was only possible if someone had been standing on my property, very close to my house. With trembling hands, I went to the backyard and removed the photograph. On the back, in neat handwritten letters, it said, "You have a very predictable routine." -MI immediately called the police. The officer who responded, Officer Johnson, was polite but skeptical. "Have you had any conflict with your neighbor?" he asked as he examined the photograph. No conflict. We've barely spoken, but he's been acting very strangely since he moved in." I told the officer about the holes in the fence, the strange behavior patterns, and the binocular observation Mrs. Peterson had reported. "Ma'am, I understand you're concerned, but technically, taking photographs from public property isn't illegal, and drilling holes in his own fence isn't either. But what about trespassing on my property to take the photograph? Do you have evidence that he trespassed? Did you see footprints, signs of forced entry?" I didn't have any of those things. The photograph could have technically been taken from Marcus's property with a telephoto lens, though the angle made that unlikely. "I suggest you install security cameras," Officer Johnson said. "And if you have any more concrete incidents, call us immediately." That afternoon, I installed a security camera system around my property. 4 night vision cameras covering all angles of my house and yard. If Marcus was playing psychological games with me, at least I'd have evidence the next time. Marcus's reaction to my cameras was immediate and escalatory. That night, I noticed he had installed high-intensity floodlights in his backyard, All pointed directly at my property. When night fell, my backyard was lit up like a football stadium. But the floodlights were just the beginning. Over the next few days, Marcus began what I can only describe as a campaign of psychological warfare against me. It started with noises. During the night, I would hear strange sounds coming from his property. Repetitive hammering that lasted exactly 30 seconds, followed by 30 seconds of silence for hours. Music that would blast at high volume for exactly 3 minutes, then stop completely. Doors opening and closing in rhythmic patterns. The sounds always stopped just before they were consistent or loud enough to be considered a violation of the city's noise ordinances. It was as if he had researched exactly what the legal limits were and was operating just within them. Then the letters started. He didn't leave them in my mailbox. That would have been a federal crime. Instead, he taped them to telephone poles near my house, on my car's windshield when it was parked on the public street, on the fence separating our properties on the public side. The letters didn't contain direct threats, which made them even more unsettling. They said things like, "Juana, I noticed you changed your exercise routine. Tuesday, you ran 15 minutes longer than usual. Are you training for something special? Your car made a funny noise when you got home Thursday at 4:23 p.m. You should check the left brake. I saw you got an Amazon delivery on Saturday. Hope you enjoyed your new book." Each letter demonstrated a level of obsessive surveillance that made me feel completely exposed and vulnerable. Marcus was documenting every aspect of my daily life with a detail that was technically legal but deeply invasive. I took the letters to the police again, but once more, Officer Johnson told me that while the behavior was odd, it wasn't technically illegal. "Has he made any direct threats?" he asked. "No, but he's clearly stalking me." "Ma'am, stalking requires a pattern of behavior that causes reasonable fear. These letters, while strange, don't contain threats." "But he's watching my every move. From his own property, which is his right. Look, I understand you're scared, but until he does something overtly illegal, we can't act." That conversation left me feeling completely unprotected. Marcus had found a way to terrorize my daily life while staying technically within the bounds of the law. But what he didn't know was that I had started my own documentation, and the security cameras I had installed were capturing behaviors that went far beyond just watching from his property. By late November, my security cameras began capturing evidence that finally proved Marcus was crossing clear legal lines. The first major recording was of him entering my backyard at 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday night. In the video, you could clearly see Marcus using tools to create new observation holes in the fence, but from my side of the property. Technically, this constituted trespassing and property damage. I had solid evidence for the first time, but when I reviewed more footage, I found something even more disturbing. Marcus wasn't just entering my property at night. He was conducting what looked like detailed inspections of my house. He walked around the perimeter, testing windows and doors, and on one occasion, he spent nearly 20 minutes examining my exterior electrical system. The most terrifying was a recording showing him using some kind of electronic device near my windows. After researching online, I realized it appeared to be a directional listening device, equipment that would allow him to listen to conversations inside my house from outside. Armed with this evidence, I went back to the police. This time, Officer Johnson took my concerns much more seriously. "This definitely constitutes trespassing," he said as he reviewed the footage. "Do you have more evidence like this?" "Hours of footage. He's been entering my property almost every night for the last 2 weeks. We're going to arrest him immediately." But when the police went to number 47 to arrest Marcus, they found something unexpected. The house was empty. Not empty, as in he had stepped out for the day, but completely empty. No furniture, no personal belongings, no sign that anyone had lived there recently. "Are you sure this is the right place?" Officer Johnson asked when he returned to my house. "Of course I'm sure. He was living right there next door." "Well, there's no one there now." The house is completely empty, and it looks like it's been that way for some time. That's impossible. He was there last night. I saw the lights. I saw his silhouette in the windows. Officer Johnson gave me a look I had come to hate. The look that suggested maybe I was imagining things. Ma'am, we're going to investigate this thoroughly, but I need to ask, have you been under a lot of stress lately? Have you spoken with a mental health professional? I'm not crazy, I shouted, my frustration finally boiling over. I have video evidence. I have photographs. I have the letters. We'll review all your evidence carefully, he assured me. In the meantime, is there somewhere you can stay tonight? Maybe with family or friends. I didn't like the implication, but I decided to stay with my sister that night. I needed time to process what had happened and plan my next steps. The next day, I returned to my house with my sister to show her the evidence I had gathered and to pick up more clothes. But when we arrived, we found something that took my breath away. The holes in the fence had been repaired, all of them. The fence looked brand new, with no sign it had ever been tampered with. Juana, my sister said gently, are you sure about these holes? This fence looks like it's never been touched. I ran to my computer and opened the photographs I had taken of the holes in the fence. The photos clearly showed the holes, with date and time stamps. But when I compared the photos to the fence now, it was like I was looking at two completely different places. Then I checked the footage from my security cameras. The recordings of Marcus entering my property were still there, but now there was something odd about them. The video quality was different, grainier, and there were inconsistencies in the timestamps I hadn't noticed before. Is it possible someone tampered with these recordings digitally? My sister asked, who worked in IT. But why would they do that? I don't know. But are you sure you didn't tamper with them yourself? Maybe unintentionally, during a period of stress, or... I didn't tamper with my own recordings, and I'm not crazy. But even as I said it, I was starting to doubt my own sanity. Was it possible I had imagined everything? That the stress of work and living alone had driven me to some kind of psychological breakdown? That night, I decided to make one last effort to prove Marcus had been real. I went to number 47 and knocked on the door, knowing there would be no answer but needing to try. As expected, there was no response. But as I walked around the house, peering into the windows, I saw something that confirmed I hadn't been imagining everything. On the ground, partially hidden under some leaves, I found the plate I had used to deliver the welcome cake to Marcus 2 months earlier. Finding the plate gave me new determination. I hadn't been imagining Marcus Kellerman, and I needed to find out what had really happened. If the police weren't going to investigate, I'd have to do it myself. I started with the basics. Had someone really been living at number 47 during those 2 months? I contacted the utility company, and after explaining my situation, was able to confirm that the house had had electricity and gas service for exactly the period Marcus had been there. The records showed a pattern of electricity usage consistent with what I had observed. Heavy nighttime use, with regular spikes between 8:30 p.m. and 11:47 p.m., and minimal consumption during daytime hours. I also contacted the Postal Service. After a lot of persistence, I confirmed that during November, they had been delivering regular mail to M. Kellerman at number 47 Millfield Avenue. Armed with this evidence, I went back to number 47 and decided to investigate more closely. The house was clearly empty now, but maybe he had left some clue about his identity or where he had gone. The windows were locked, but I found a basement window that wasn't fully secured. After much internal debate about the legality of what I was considering, I decided I needed answers more than I needed to follow every rule. The basement of the house was dark and smelled of dampness, but when I turned on my phone's flashlight, I could see clear evidence of recent occupancy. There were rectangular marks on the floor where heavy equipment or furniture had obviously been. There were also extension cords suggesting multiple electronic devices had been in use. In one corner of the basement, I found something that chilled my blood, a small hole drilled in the wall facing my basement. The hole was large enough to pass cables or even a small camera through. I ran to my own basement and, sure enough, found evidence that someone had been there. There were small marks on the floor suggesting someone had been walking regularly in my basement, and on the wall separating our houses, there was a small hole that had been carefully concealed behind a storage box. The realization that Marcus had had access to my house for months left me feeling violated in a way I had never experienced before. He hadn't just been watching me from outside. He had been inside my home, possibly installing surveillance devices. That night, I couldn't stay in my house. I went to a hotel while I processed the implications of what I had found. The next day, I hired a professional security company to thoroughly inspect my house for surveillance devices. The results were devastating. They found 6 listening devices hidden in various rooms, 2 miniature cameras, one in my bedroom and one in my office, and evidence that my computer had been compromised with surveillance software. "How long have these devices been here?" I asked the technician. Based on the sophistication and positioning, I'd say at least 2 months, possibly more. And they would have allowed someone to watch and listen to everything I did in my house. "Yes, ma'am." "Whoever installed this had full access to your private life. With this evidence, I went back to the police. This time, there was no way they could dismiss my concerns. This is very serious," Officer Johnson admitted when I showed him the devices that had been found. "This constitutes multiple felonies: trespassing, installing illegal surveillance devices, harassment, and possibly stalking." "So you're going to investigate?" "Absolutely. We're going to open a full criminal investigation into Marcus Kellerman." But the investigation revealed something even more unsettling than I had imagined. When the police looked into the identity of Marcus Kellerman, they discovered there was no such person. The name was fake. The documents he had used to rent the house were forged. Even the license plates on the car I had seen in his driveway were fake. "So, who was he?" I asked. "We don't know," the detective who had taken over the case admitted. "But based on the sophistication of the surveillance operation and the use of a false identity, we're treating this as an investigation into professional stalking." Professional stalking. Someone with significant resources and advanced technical skills who targeted you specifically for reasons we don't yet understand. The police investigation continued for months, but never produced concrete results. Marcus Kellerman, whoever he really was, had vanished as completely as he had appeared. There was no financial trail, no useful forensic evidence, and no witnesses who could provide a detailed description of him. The most frustrating part was that he seemed to have perfectly anticipated when to leave. Utility records showed that electricity usage at number 47 had stopped completely exactly 24 hours before the police had tried to arrest him. It was as if he had known I had gathered enough evidence to involve the authorities. "Is it possible he was monitoring my communications with the police?" I asked the detective. "It's possible. Given the level of surveillance he had installed in your house, it's likely he had access to your phones and internet too." That possibility terrified me even more. It meant that for months, he hadn't just been watching my daily life, but had also had access to my private conversations, my emails, my online activities. I had had no privacy whatsoever during the time he had been living next door. After 6 months of fruitless investigation, the detective gave me a final update that offered no comfort. "Miss Wanna, we've exhausted all available leads in this case. Marcus Kellerman, or whoever he really was, appears to have been a highly skilled professional at evading detection. Without further evidence or leads, we have to close the active investigation, so I'll never know who he was or why he was stalking me. Honestly, it's unlikely. But we want you to know that the case remains open, and if any new information ever comes up, we'll resume the investigation immediately. And if he comes back, we have your information in an alert database. If anyone matching his description comes up in any future investigations, we'll be notified. But frankly, people who operate at this level of sophistication generally don't repeat patterns in the same area. That conversation marked the end of my hope for answers about who Marcus had been and why he had chosen to torment my life. Over the next few months, I tried to rebuild my sense of security. I installed even more advanced security systems, changed all my locks multiple times, and hired the same security company to do monthly inspections for new surveillance devices. But the paranoia never fully left me. Every new neighbor filled me with anxiety. Every nighttime noise made me jump. Every sign that someone might be paying too much attention to my routine sent me into a state of high alert. The hardest part was the lack of understanding from others about what I had experienced. To most people, my story sounded almost unbelievable. A neighbor who had set up a professional surveillance operation, used a false identity, and then vanished completely without a trace seemed more like the plot of a thriller movie than something that could happen in a quiet suburban neighborhood. Maybe he was a private investigator, my sister suggested once. Maybe someone had hired him to investigate you for some reason. But who? And why? I don't know. An ex-boyfriend, a disgruntled client, someone involved in a legal case. I had considered all these possibilities, but none made sense. I hadn't had serious relationships in years. My work as a freelance graphic designer didn't involve controversial clients, and I had never been involved in any legal situation that would justify this level of surveillance. The detective's theory was that I had been a victim of what they called random professional stalking. Individuals who choose victims at random and harass them using sophisticated methods, not for personal reasons, but as some kind of psychological game or compulsion. Does that really exist? I asked. More than people realize, he admitted. There are individuals who have the resources and skills to do this, and they do it for reasons only they understand. They typically choose victims who live alone, have predictable routines, and live in areas where they can operate without being easily detected. That explanation offered no comfort, but it at least provided a framework for understanding what had happened. Now, 5 years later, I live in a completely different city, in a house I chose specifically for its security features. I've rebuilt my life, but the scars of those months have never fully faded. I never learned the true identity of Marcus Kellerman. I never understood why I was chosen as his target. I never got answers about what he had planned to do long-term, or what would have happened if I hadn't installed those security cameras when I did. What I do know is that I was the victim of someone who had turned stalking into a science, someone who had studied the legal limitations of the system and built his methods specifically to operate within those limits as much as possible. Someone who had the resources to maintain a complete false identity for months and to vanish without a trace when necessary. Sometimes, I wonder if he's doing the same thing to someone else somewhere. If another woman is experiencing the same feelings of being watched, the same gradual escalation of privacy invasion, the same sense of helplessness against someone who understands the system better than she does. I reported my story to organizations that track patterns of stalking and harassment, hoping that if Marcus, or whoever he really was, repeats his behavior, the authorities might connect the patterns and finally catch him. But I've also accepted that I may never know the full truth about what happened to me, that I may never understand why I was chosen, what Marcus wanted from me, or where he went when he disappeared. What I do know is that the neighbor moved out overnight, and nothing more was ever heard of him. And that, perhaps, is the most terrifying part of all, that someone can enter your life, fundamentally disrupt your sense of safety, and then simply vanish, leaving you with questions that may never have answers. If you're reading this and have experienced something similar, a neighbor who seems to know too much about your life, who displays strange behavior patterns, who makes you feel watched or followed, trust your instincts. Document everything. Install security cameras. Don't assume that just because someone hasn't made direct threats, they're not dangerous. And remember that there are people who turn stalking into a sophisticated art form, who can operate for months or even years without being detected, and who can disappear as completely as they appeared. The man at number 47 Millfield Avenue changed my life forever. I'll never know who he really was, but I know he was real, and I know that somewhere, someone else might be experiencing exactly what I went through. The neighbor moved out overnight, and nothing more was heard of him. But the fear he left behind, that stayed. This neighbor was always very strange. That's the only way to start this story, because from the first day I moved to Oak Ridge Drive in Sacramento, California, I knew there was something deeply odd about the man who lived in the greenhouse at the end of the street. It was the summer of 2019, and I had just landed my first job as a junior programmer at a tech startup. At 27 years old, I finally had enough savings to rent a small house in a decent neighborhood, far from the college apartment I'd shared for years. The house I found was perfect for my needs: 2 bedrooms, an office where I could work from home, and a small backyard where I hoped to one day have a dog. But from the moment the real estate agent showed me the property, I noticed something unsettling about the house at the end of the street. It was a single-story house, painted dark green, with windows that always seemed to be covered by thick curtains. The yard was impeccably maintained, too perfect to be natural, but I never saw anyone working on it. "Who lives in that house?" I asked the agent, pointing toward the greenhouse. "Oh, that's Mr. Vasquez," he replied with an expression I couldn't fully interpret. "He's lived there for years. Very private." The way he paused before saying private made me feel there was more to the story, but I didn't press for details. During my first few weeks in the house, I began noticing strange patterns related to my mysterious neighbor. I never saw him during the day, but at night, I often heard the sound of a car pulling into his driveway around 11 o'clock. Sometimes there were multiple cars, and the visits lasted into the early hours of the morning. One night, while working late on my computer, I glanced out the window and saw something that made me pause. There were at least 4 cars parked in the driveway and in front of the greenhouse. All were dark sedans with tinted windows, the kind of cars you see in movies about mobsters or federal agents. What caught my attention most were the silhouettes I could occasionally see passing in front of the lit windows. They seemed to be in some kind of meeting, with gestures suggesting intense conversations or even arguments. Around 3 in the morning, the cars began to leave, one by one, until only one remained, which I assumed belonged to Mr. Vasquez. The entire house went dark, and the street returned to its usual silence. This routine repeated 2 or 3 times a week for the next month. Nighttime meetings, multiple cars, conversations stretching into the early hours, all very quiet, very discreet, but definitely out of the ordinary for a residential neighborhood. My first direct interaction with Mr. Vasquez happened on a Saturday morning in September. I was washing my car in the driveway when I noticed someone standing in his yard, watching me. He was a middle-aged man, maybe 45 to 50 years old, slim but with a posture that suggested physical strength. He had black hair with gray at the temples and was wearing dark jeans and a pristine white button-up shirt. What struck me most were his eyes. They were incredibly intense, as if constantly assessing everything around him for potential threats. When our eyes met, he raised his hand in a silent wave. I returned the gesture, but he didn't approach or attempt conversation. He just stood there for a few more moments, studying me, before going back inside his house. That brief interaction left me with an odd feeling. It hadn't been threatening exactly, but there was something about the way he'd watched me that made me feel as if I'd been evaluated in some way. Over the next few weeks, these silent observations became a pattern. Often when I was in my yard or coming home from work, I'd notice Mr. Vasquez somewhere on his property, just watching. He never approached, never tried to strike up a conversation, but he always seemed aware of my movements. One afternoon, while watering my plants, I heard raised voices coming from the greenhouse. I couldn't make out specific words, but the tone was clearly confrontational. There were at least 2 male voices, possibly 3, and the conversation sounded increasingly heated. Suddenly, the front door of the house swung open, and a man I didn't recognize stormed out, clearly agitated. He was younger than Mr. Vasquez, maybe in his 30s, and was wearing an expensive but wrinkled suit. He walked quickly to a black BMW parked on the street and sped off. A few minutes later, Mr. Vasquez appeared at his door, staring down the street in the direction the car had gone. His posture was tense, and I could see his fist was clenched. When he noticed me watching, he looked directly at me and, to my surprise, shook his head subtly, as if warning me about something. That night, I couldn't sleep well. There was something about the whole situation that put me on edge. The nighttime meetings, the fancy cars, the intense conversations, and now confrontations ending with people leaving angrily from the house. It all suggested my neighbor was involved in some kind of activity that went beyond normal neighborhood matters. But what worried me most was the feeling that somehow I was being pulled into a situation I didn't understand, and over which I had no control. As the weeks went by, my unease about Mr. Vasquez only intensified. The nighttime meetings continued, but now I had noticed something more disturbing. It seemed our street was being watched. During the day, I occasionally saw unfamiliar cars parked on the street, usually with 1 or 2 people inside who appeared to be just waiting. They weren't neighborhood cars. I knew all my immediate neighbors' vehicles, and the people inside never got out or visited any of the houses. One morning, as I left for work, I noticed a gray sedan with 2 men inside parked 3 houses down from mine. One of the men had binoculars and seemed to be watching the greenhouse. As I passed by the car, they tried to look casual, but it was obvious they were conducting some kind of surveillance. That afternoon, when I returned from work, the same car was still there, but with different occupants. That's when I started to worry that simply by living on the same street as Mr. Vasquez, I might be in danger. If he was involved in illegal activities, and if someone else was investigating those activities, all the residents of the street could end up as collateral victims of whatever was going on. I decided to talk to some of my other neighbors to see if they had noticed anything strange. Mrs. Chen, who lived 2 houses down, was the first person I approached. She was an older, retired woman who spent a lot of time in her garden and would have a good perspective on neighborhood activities. "Oh, yes," she said when I asked about Mr. Vasquez. "He's definitely unique. He's lived there for almost 10 years, but I think I've spoken to him fewer than 5 times in all that time. Have you noticed the nighttime meetings? The cars coming late at night?" Mrs. Chen grew serious. "Yes, and honestly, they worry me. My bedroom faces that direction, and I'm often woken up by the sound of cars coming and going at all hours. Sometimes I hear raised voices. Have you ever considered calling the police?" I've thought about it, but what would I tell them? That my neighbor has late-night visitors. Technically, they're not doing anything illegal that I can prove. That conversation confirmed my suspicions that I wasn't the only one who had noticed strange behavior, but it also highlighted the tricky nature of the situation. Without concrete evidence of criminal activity, there wasn't much any of us could do officially. My next conversation was with Mark, a guy in his 30s who lived directly across the street from the greenhouse. As a programmer who often worked from home, I thought he might have noticed patterns I had missed. "Man, I'm glad you brought it up," Mark said when I asked about Mr. Vasquez. "That guy gives me the creeps. He never causes trouble directly, but there's something about him that just feels dangerous." "Dangerous how?" "It's hard to explain. It's the way he moves, the way he watches everything, like a predator studying his territory. And those cars that show up at night. Man, I've seen some license plates that are definitely not from California." "What do you mean?" "Plates from Nevada, Arizona. I even saw one from Texas once. Who has regular visitors from that far away? This information added a new dimension to my concerns. If Mr. Vasquez was having regular meetings with people from multiple states, that suggested an operation on a much larger scale than I had imagined. That night, I decided to conduct my own more systematic observation. I set up my computer near the window facing the greenhouse and began documenting the patterns I'd been casually noticing. Between 11:15 at night and 11:45, 4 different cars arrived. 2 black sedans, a gray SUV, and a red sports car I'd never seen before. The occupants, all men, from what I could tell, entered the house quickly, without lingering outside. The meeting lasted until about 2:30 in the morning. During that time, I could see shadows moving behind the curtains, and on several occasions the voices got loud enough that I could hear them through closed windows, though I couldn't make out specific words. The most unsettling part was what happened as the visitors began to leave. Instead of leaving all at once, they left in intervals of about 10 minutes, as if trying to avoid being seen leaving together. But what truly alarmed me was that just before the last car left, I saw Mr. Vasquez step out of his house and walk to the curb. He looked directly at my window, where he knew I was watching, and made a gesture with his hand. It wasn't a friendly wave. It was a clear, deliberate signal, as if he was telling me he knew I'd been watching him. The day after Mr. Vasquez signaled me from his yard, I woke up to find a note slipped under my front door. The paper was high quality, and the handwriting was clear and polite. "Pedro, we need to talk. If you're free this afternoon around 4 o'clock, I'll be in my backyard. It's important. E. Vasquez." My first reaction was panic. How did he know my name? I had never told him, and while I suppose he could have found out in several ways, the fact that he knew it made me feel exposed and vulnerable. My second reaction was debating whether to respond to his invitation. On one hand, my curiosity about what was happening at the greenhouse had consumed my thoughts for weeks. On the other hand, every instinct told me that getting more deeply involved in Mr. Vasquez's situation could be dangerous. Finally, I decided I needed answers. If I was going to continue living on this street, I needed to know if I was in danger and what kind of situation was unfolding in my neighborhood. At 4 o'clock exactly, I walked to the greenhouse. The front yard was impeccable as always, but I noticed details I'd overlooked before. The plants had been specifically chosen to provide natural privacy, creating visual barriers that made it hard to see inside the property from the street. I walked around the side of the house to the backyard, where I found Mr. Vasquez waiting for me by a small patio table. Up close, I could see he was older than I'd initially thought, probably in his mid-50s, but he was in excellent physical shape. His eyes were even more intense in person, and there was a constant alertness in his posture that suggested he was always ready to act. "Thank you for coming, Pedro," he said, gesturing to a chair. "Please sit." "How do you know my name?" I asked directly. "It's my job to know who lives in my neighborhood," he replied, which wasn't really an answer. "But that's not why I asked you to come." "Then what's the reason?" Eduardo, as he formally introduced himself, leaned forward, his eyes never leaving my face. "You've been watching my house for weeks. You've noticed the nighttime visits, the strange cars, probably even the surveillance that started recently." "Surveillance?" "The cars that have been parked on our street. The men with binoculars. Pedro, you're living next to a situation that's about to become very dangerous, and I wanted to warn you." My heart started beating faster. Dangerous how? "There are people who want to hurt me. People with significant resources and few moral scruples. By living so close, you could become collateral damage if things escalate." "Why are you telling me this? Wouldn't it be easier to just leave?" Eduardo was silent for a long moment, studying my face as if trying to decide how much truth to share. "Pedro, what do you think I do for a living?" "Honestly, I have no idea. The nighttime meetings, the fancy cars, the surveillance, it could be anything. Drugs, money laundering, organized crime. And if I told you I worked for the government? That wasn't the answer I expected. The government? I can't give you specific details, but yes, I work for a federal agency. The meetings you've observed, the people coming to my house, it's all part of a long-term operation that's been in progress for years. Then why the surveillance? Why the threats? Because the operation is nearing its conclusion, and there are people who've discovered my real identity. People who have a lot to lose if the operation succeeds. Eduardo stood from the table and walked to the perimeter of his yard, checking the points where his property connected to neighboring properties. Pedro, the reason I'm telling you this is because I need your help. Your help. I'm not a federal agent, I'm a programmer. Exactly. You're a normal civilian with no apparent connection to me. That makes you valuable. Valuable how? The people watching me are going to make a move soon. Probably within the next few days. When they do, I need someone they wouldn't expect to call a specific number and report what's happening. Eduardo pulled a card from his pocket and handed it to me. It had only a phone number printed on it. If you see anything unusual, more cars than normal, armed people, any sign of violence, call this number immediately. Don't call 911. Call this number. Why can't you call it yourself? Because if things go wrong, I might not be in a position to call anyone. The implication of his words hit me like a punch to the stomach. He was essentially telling me he expected to be attacked, possibly killed, and he wanted me to be his backup to ensure the right authorities were notified. Eduardo, this is way above my pay grade. I'm not trained for this kind of situation. You don't need training. You just need to be alert and make a phone call if necessary. And if I refuse? Eduardo looked at me with an expression that was part understanding, part sadness. Then I'll probably die. The operation will fail, and some very bad people will continue doing very bad things. But I won't force you, Pedro. It's your choice. That night, after my conversation with Eduardo, I couldn't sleep. I had gone from being a casual observer of odd neighborly behavior to, apparently, a key piece in some kind of undercover federal operation. The card with the phone number sat on my nightstand, and I stared at it every few minutes as if it would reveal more information about what was expected of me. Over the next 2 days, the neighborhood felt tense in ways I couldn't fully explain. The surveillance cars I'd been seeing occasionally now seemed to be a constant presence. There were different cars with different occupants, but there was always someone watching the greenhouse. I also noticed Eduardo had changed his patterns. Instead of the regular nighttime meetings, his house stayed dark most nights. But during the day, I occasionally saw him moving around his property in ways that suggested he was checking security measures or preparing for something. On Wednesday afternoon, while working on my computer, I heard the sound of multiple cars arriving on the street at once. I looked out the window and saw something that immediately put me on high alert. 3 black SUVs had pulled up and parked in strategic positions around the greenhouse. They weren't the sedans I'd been seeing over the past weeks. These were larger, more intimidating vehicles, and the people who got out of them clearly weren't law enforcement. There were 6 men in total, all dressed casually, but moving with military-like coordination. 2 headed to the back of the greenhouse, 2 positioned themselves at the front, and 2 started walking directly toward the front door. That's when I realized this was what Eduardo had been waiting for. With trembling hands, I pulled out the card he had given me and dialed the number. The phone rang only once before a female voice answered. "Identification code," the voice asked. "I don't have an identification code," I replied. "Eduardo Vasquez told me to call this number if I saw suspicious activity at his house. Name? Pedro. I live next door. What are you seeing?" 6 men, 3 SUVs. They're positioning themselves around his house. It looks like they're preparing for, I don't know, some kind of assault. Understood. Stay on the line and keep reporting what you see. Through my window, I could see the 2 men at the front door had started working on the lock. They weren't ringing the bell or trying to enter peacefully. This was clearly a break-in. "They're forcing entry through the front door," I reported. "Can you see the target?" I assumed the target referred to Eduardo. "No, I can't see inside the house." Suddenly, the front door swung open, and the two men entered quickly. Almost simultaneously, I could hear sounds of forced entry from the back of the house. "They've entered the house from multiple points," I reported. For the next few minutes, which felt like hours, the street was silent except for occasional sounds of movement from inside the greenhouse. Then, I heard something that made me shudder. The unmistakable sound of gunshots. "Gunshots," I shouted into the phone. "I hear gunshots from inside the house. Units are on the way. Can you see if any of the attackers have come out?" I kept my eyes fixed on the visible exits of the house. After what felt like an eternity, I saw one of the men run out the front door. He was clearly injured, holding his left arm and moving urgently toward one of the SUVs. "One of the attackers just came out. He looks injured," I reported. "Any sign of the target?" "No. Wait." The back door of the house opened, and I saw Eduardo come out. But he wasn't alone. He was being forced out by one of the attackers, who had a gun pointed at his back. "The target is being escorted out of the house under armed duress," I reported, my voice trembling. "Direction of movement?" "Toward the SUVs on the street." That's when I made a decision that changed everything. Instead of staying in my house reporting as an observer, I decided I couldn't just watch Eduardo be kidnapped or killed without doing something. "I'm going to intervene," I told the person on the phone. "Negative. Stay in your location. Response units are only minutes away." But I hung up the phone. Eduardo had warned me that these people had significant resources and few moral scruples. If they took him away in those SUVs, the response units might never find him alive. I ran out of my house through the back door and dashed to my garage. My plan wasn't sophisticated. I'd use my car to block the SUV's exit and cause enough commotion that the attackers would be forced to flee, or, at the very least, the authorities on their way would have a better chance of intervening. I got in my car and drove straight onto the street, positioning my vehicle to block the nearest SUV. Then I got out of the car and started shouting as loudly as I could. "Help! Kidnapping! Call the police!" My plan was to create enough noise and chaos to alert the entire neighborhood and make the attackers realize their operation had been compromised. It worked, but not in the way I expected. The man who had been forcing Eduardo toward the SUVs immediately turned toward me, his gun now pointed in my direction. "Get back," he shouted. "This isn't your business." But Eduardo seized the distraction. With a swift move that revealed professional training, he broke free from his captor and struck him precisely on the wrist, causing the gun to drop to the ground. What followed was total chaos. The other attackers converged on the spot where Eduardo and his original captor were now fighting physically. I kept shouting, hoping to alert as many neighbors as possible. And in the distance, I could finally hear the sound of sirens approaching. Eduardo was clearly outnumbered, but he was fighting with a skill and ferocity that suggested extensive military or law enforcement training. Still, it was 5 against 1. And he was gradually being overpowered. That's when I made another impulsive decision. I ran toward where Eduardo and the attackers were fighting, and just threw myself into the middle of the fray. I had no combat training, but I thought creating more chaos and confusion might give Eduardo a better chance to escape, or at the very least hold out until the authorities arrived. My intervention was effective, but mostly because no one expected an untrained civilian to throw himself into the middle of an armed fight. For a moment, everyone, including Eduardo, seemed confused by what I'd done, but that moment of confusion was enough. The sirens were now clearly audible and getting closer fast. The attackers realized their window of opportunity had closed. "Let's go," one of them shouted, and they ran to their SUVs. Within seconds, all 3 vehicles had peeled out and sped away from the street, leaving me and Eduardo in the middle of the road, both bruised but alive. "Pedro," Eduardo said, breathing heavily, "that was incredibly stupid. But it worked, I replied, also trying to catch my breath. Yeah, he admitted, with something that might have been a smile on his bloodied face. It worked. The authorities arrived less than a minute later, but it wasn't just the local police. There were federal agents, specialized vehicles, and what looked like a full crisis response team. In the days following the incident, I learned the full truth about Eduardo Vasquez and why he had been living on Oak Ridge Drive for the past years. Eduardo wasn't his real name, and he had been working undercover for the FBI on a 5-year investigation into a human trafficking network operating across multiple states. The nighttime meetings I had observed weren't criminal activity. They were meetings with other agents and encounters with informants, helping to build cases against the real criminals. The people who had attacked his house were members of the trafficking network, who had discovered his real identity and decided to eliminate him before the investigation could go to trial. The operation had been compromised, Eduardo explained to me during one of our later meetings. Someone inside the organization started to suspect, and they decided to take preemptive action. But why live in a residential neighborhood? Wouldn't it have been safer to live in a more covert location? Sometimes the best way to hide is in plain sight, he replied. Living in a normal suburban neighborhood gave me credibility with informants and allowed me to hold meetings that looked innocuous from the outside. And now what happens? Now, thanks in part to your intervention, we have enough evidence to prosecute dozens of people involved in the network. The investigation was successful, but Eduardo also revealed something I didn't expect. His undercover work was over, but the years of living a false identity, of being constantly on guard, of being unable to form normal relationships, had taken a severe toll on his mental health and overall well-being. Pedro, I can do this work, but I can't live a normal life while doing it, he told me one afternoon. And after what happened that night, when I thought I was going to die, I realized I don't want to sacrifice the possibility of a real life for the job anymore. What are you going to do? I'm going to leave the FBI, but that means starting completely over. New identity, this time permanent. New career, new life. And honestly, it's terrifying. That's when I realized how I could truly help Eduardo. The months of watching him, worrying about him, and finally stepping in at his most dangerous moment had created a bond between us that went beyond just being neighbors. Eduardo, I said, you don't have to do it alone. Over the next few weeks, I helped Eduardo transition from his undercover life to something resembling a normal existence. He had developed incredibly valuable skills during his time with the FBI, data analysis, investigation, cybersecurity, but he had no idea how to apply those skills in the normal corporate world. Using my connections in the tech industry, I was able to help him get interviews for positions at security consulting firms. His unique background made him incredibly valuable to companies needing expertise in protecting against both physical and digital threats. But more important than the professional help was the emotional support. Eduardo had spent years unable to form real friendships or maintain relationships. He had been living in isolation, always on guard, never able to fully relax or trust others. Pedro, he told me one day, I can't remember the last time I had a normal conversation with someone. A conversation where I didn't have to keep track of a cover story or worry about revealing information that could compromise an investigation. Well, now you can have as many normal conversations as you want, I replied. In fact, I think you've got some years of normal conversations to catch up on. Gradually, Eduardo began to transform. The intense, hyper-vigilant man who had been my mysterious neighbor started to relax into someone who seemed more human. He began to smile more, to make jokes, to take an interest in things unrelated to work or survival. He also started to build relationships with other neighbors. Mrs. Chen, who had been suspicious of him for years, ended up regularly inviting him over for dinner after learning he had been working undercover to protect people from human trafficking. Mark, my programmer neighbor, started hanging out with him on weekends, teaching him about video games and showing him movies he had missed during his years of undercover work. Now, 3 years after that chaotic night when I nearly saw my neighbor kidnapped, Eduardo has become one of the most important people in my life. He works for a security consulting firm where he uses his expertise to help companies protect against corporate espionage and cyber threats. He also volunteers with organizations that help survivors of human trafficking reintegrate into normal lives. But more important to me personally, Eduardo became the hero I never knew I needed. 6 months after the incident, my professional life started to fall apart. The startup where I worked collapsed due to financial mismanagement, and I found myself unemployed in an incredibly competitive job market. My savings dwindled quickly, and I began facing the possibility of losing my house. It was Eduardo who helped me navigate that crisis, not just by using his contacts to help me find work, but by providing emotional support during one of the toughest periods of my life. "Pedro," he told me when I was considering moving back in with my parents, "you saved me when I was in the most dangerous moment of my life. Let me help you now that you're in one of the toughest moments of yours." Eduardo used his contacts in the security industry to get me interviews, helped me prepare for those interviews, and even loaned me money to keep me afloat while I looked for work. But more importantly, he reminded me daily that temporary crises don't define a person's worth. "You ran into danger to help a stranger," he told me one night when I was particularly down. "That says something fundamental about who you are as a person, and companies are going to see that quality in you if you give them the chance." He was right. I eventually landed a position even better than the one I had lost, working for a company that valued both my technical skills and my willingness to take initiative in tough situations. But Eduardo didn't stop there. Over the past few years, he's become the kind of friend and mentor everyone deserves, but few are lucky enough to find. When I started dating again, he helped me navigate the complexities of relationships after years of focusing solely on my career. When I decided to buy a bigger house, he helped me with the negotiation process and even connected me with reliable contractors for renovations. More importantly, Eduardo taught me lessons about courage, loyalty, and the importance of taking action when you witness injustice that have fundamentally changed how I view my responsibilities as a member of a community. "Pedro," he told me recently, "a lot of people talk about wanting to make a difference in the world, but when the opportunity to actually help someone comes up, they find excuses not to get involved. You didn't do that. When I needed help, you didn't hesitate to put yourself at risk." I was terrified, I reminded him. It wasn't courage, it was stupidity. "Sometimes," Eduardo replied with a smile. "The line between courage and stupidity is determined by whether things turn out okay in the end." And things turned out very okay. Eduardo now lives in a new house in the same neighborhood, just a few streets away. He's no longer the mysterious man with secret nighttime meetings and constant security concerns. He's my friend Eduardo, who hosts barbecues on weekends, volunteers as a youth baseball coach, and has become one of the pillars of our community. But sometimes, when we're hanging out in his backyard, I catch glimpses of the trained federal agent he used to be. The way he automatically positions himself to see all the exits of a room. The way he notices small details about people that most of us would overlook. The way he can assess potential threats with just a quick glance at his surroundings. Those reminders of his past no longer unsettle me. Instead, they make me feel safer, knowing that if danger ever returns to our quiet suburban street, we have someone with the skills and experience to handle it. And I know that if I ever face another crisis in my life, I have a friend who understands what it means to have someone step up and take action when it's needed. This neighbor was always very strange, it's true, but it turned out his strange behavior had been protecting people from some genuinely evil individuals. And when he needed protection himself, I somehow found the courage to step up and help him. In return, He became the hero of my own story, helping me through challenges I never could have handled alone, and teaching me lessons about friendship, loyalty, and community that will stay with me for the rest of my life. Sometimes the people who seem most dangerous on the surface turn out to be exactly the people you need in your corner when life gets tough. And sometimes, acting on instinct to help someone else in their moment of greatest need results in gaining exactly the kind of support system you never knew you needed. Eduardo Vasquez started as the strange neighbor, whose behavior scared and confused everyone in the neighborhood. He ended up becoming a beloved community member who uses his unique skills to make everyone feel safer and more protected. And for me, he transformed from a source of anxiety and suspicion into one of the most important, positive influences in my life. Not all heroes wear capes. Some of them start as the weird neighbor whose nighttime activities make you worry about your safety. But if you're lucky, and if you're brave enough to take action when they need help, they might turn out to be exactly the person who will be there for you when you need them most. For many years, I lived next to that man, and nothing like this had ever happened. That's the only way I can begin this story, because for nearly 4 years, Harold Jenkins had been simply the quiet neighbor on the left side of my house in Willow Creek, a small town in northern Oregon. 4 years of polite waves over the garden fence, occasional chats about the weather, and that peaceful coexistence that characterizes life in small towns. I was 25 years old when I moved into that 2-story house on Maple Street. It was my first property, a small Victorian home I had bought with savings for my job as a nurse at the regional hospital. The house had a rustic charm that I fell in love with immediately. Original hardwood floors, a brick fireplace, and a front porch perfect for summer evenings with a cup of tea. Harold lived in the house next door long before I arrived. According to the real estate agent, he had inherited the property from his parents over a decade earlier. He was a middle-aged man, perhaps 45 years old, single, and worked as an accountant at a local firm. He had a predictable routine. He left the house every weekday at exactly 7:30 in the morning, returned at 6:15 in the evening, and on weekends, he meticulously tended to his garden. During those first years, our interactions were exactly what you'd expect between cordial but not close neighbors. Harold was polite but reserved, the kind of man who waved when we saw each other in our respective yards, but never initiated long conversations. He occasionally offered help with heavy garden tasks, always keeping a respectful distance. And in the few instances we talked for more than a few minutes, he proved to be intelligent and well-informed, though somewhat shy. My life during that period was routine but fulfilling. I worked 12-hour shifts at the hospital, often including night shifts, which meant there were stretches of several days when I was barely home during daylight hours. My boyfriend at the time, Marcus, visited on weekends, but our relationship was casual, and he lived in Portland 2 hours away. The tranquility of those years gave me a false sense of security. Willow Creek was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked, where kids rode bikes until after dark without supervision, and where the most serious crimes were occasional petty thefts or domestic disputes. It was exactly the kind of environment I had sought after years of living in noisy city apartments. Harold fit perfectly into this atmosphere of suburban normalcy. He was the ideal neighbor, quiet, tidy, kept his property immaculate, and never caused trouble. In the few longer conversations we had, he showed himself to be knowledgeable about local history, gardening, and classic literature. He was the kind of person who seemed designed to live quietly in a small town without ever drawing attention. That's why what began to happen in the 5th year of our neighborly relationship was so unsettling. There were no warning signs, no gradual changes in his behavior that I could have anticipated. One day, he was Harold, the quiet accountant, and the next, Well, I suppose the next day he was still Harold, the quiet accountant, but something fundamental had changed. The change began so subtly that I initially thought I was imagining it. It was early March when I first noticed something was different. I had been working consecutive night shifts at the hospital, getting home around 7 in the morning and sleeping through the day. It was an exhausting schedule, but the extra pay for night shifts was helping me save for some home renovations I wanted to do. The first time I noticed something strange was one morning when I got home particularly tired after an especially tough night at the hospital. It had been a night of multiple emergencies, and all I wanted was to get home, take a shower, and sleep until the afternoon. As I walked up the path to my front door, I had the odd sensation of being watched. It was that familiar feeling we all know, like when someone is staring at you in a public place. I turned casually, expecting to see perhaps Harold in his yard or a neighbor walking by, but I saw no one. The feeling was strong enough to make me pause and really study my surroundings. I looked toward Harold's house, but his windows seemed empty, the curtains closed as they always were during work hours. I checked the street in both directions, but there were no pedestrians or unfamiliar parked cars. I decided fatigue was making me paranoid and went inside my house. But that feeling of being watched repeated over the next few weeks. Always in the mornings when I returned from work. Always that same lingering sense of eyes following my movements. And always, when I turned to find the source, there was nothing obvious to explain it. It was around the 3rd week of March when the feeling intensified into something more concrete. I got home one particularly foggy morning around 6:45 in the morning, about 15 minutes earlier than usual because my relief had arrived early. As I fumbled for my keys in my bag, I clearly saw a curtain move in one of the second-floor windows of Harold's house. It wasn't the kind of movement caused by wind or a house cat. It was the distinct motion of someone quickly letting go of a curtain after watching through it. The window in question looked directly toward my front entrance and pathway. From that position, Harold would have had a perfect view of me arriving home each morning. I couldn't sleep well that day. I couldn't shake the image of that curtain moving. The implication that Harold had been, what? Waiting for my arrival? Watching my morning routine? I tried to rationalize it. Maybe Harold had insomnia too. Maybe he had just been up early and glanced out the window casually when he heard my car pull in. Maybe the curtain movement had been entirely innocent. But over the next few days, I started paying closer attention. And what I noticed made me increasingly uncomfortable. Harold seemed to always be aware of my schedule. When I got home in the mornings after night shifts, I occasionally saw him in his yard, doing tasks that seemed unnecessary and positioned him with a clear view of my entrance. When I went out to run errands on weekends, I often found him casually checking his mailbox or taking out the trash. These could have been genuine coincidences, except for how frequently they happened, and the way Harold always seemed positioned to observe my activities. One Saturday afternoon, I decided to conduct a little experiment. Instead of going out for errands at my usual time, around 2 in the afternoon, I went out at 10 in the morning. Within 5 minutes of leaving my house, Harold appeared in his front yard, supposedly to check his tomato plants, which were barely sprouting in the early season. The next day, I went out at 4 in the afternoon instead of my usual time. Once again, Harold appeared in his yard within minutes of my departure. These experiments confirmed what I had begun to suspect. Harold was actively monitoring my movements. Harold's behavior in April escalated in ways that made me feel increasingly alarmed. He wasn't just watching my daytime routines. He had started showing interest in my nighttime activities. Because of my hospital shifts, I was often awake late into the night, even on my days off. My circadian rhythm was completely disrupted, so I frequently found myself reading, watching TV, or working on home projects until 2 or 3 in the morning. It was during one of these late nights, around the 2nd week of April, that I heard the first strange noise. I was in my living room, reading a book with all the downstairs lights on, when I heard what sounded like footsteps slowly walking around the exterior perimeter of my house. The steps were deliberate and measured, as if someone was carefully inspecting my property. Initially, I thought it might be an animal, maybe a large dog wandering the neighborhood, but when I turned off the TV to listen better, the sounds were unmistakably human. The rhythm was too regular, too paced to be an animal. I went to the kitchen window, which faced the side of my house bordering Harold's property, and carefully looked out. The night was dark, with only a quarter moon, but I could make out the silhouette of a figure moving slowly along the fence separating our properties. The figure stopped directly beneath my kitchen window, as if noticing the light filtering out. For several seconds, it seemed to be looking straight toward where I was standing, though the sheer curtains would have made it hard for them to see me clearly. My heart started beating faster. Should I turn on the outside light? Call out to ask who was there? Call the police? Before I could decide what to do, the figure moved away from my window and continued its path around my house. I could hear the footsteps moving toward my backyard, pausing occasionally as if examining different aspects of my property. I ran to my second-floor bedroom, which had a view of the backyard. From that window, I could clearly see a figure standing in the center of my yard looking up at my house. Though the distance and darkness made it hard to make out specific details, the size and posture of the figure felt familiar. The figure stayed in my yard for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few minutes. Then slowly, it walked toward the back fence, separating my property from Harold's, and disappeared into the darkness. I couldn't sleep that night. Every creak of the house settling, every branch rustling in the wind made me jump. I'd closed all the curtains and checked all the locks multiple times. The next day, I decided to confront Harold indirectly. When I saw him in his yard that afternoon, I walked over to the fence between our properties. "Hi, Harold," I said, trying to sound casual. "Were you up late last night?" I heard some strange noises around my house. Harold looked up from the flowers he was planting and gave me a completely neutral expression. "No. I go to bed early most nights," he replied. "What kind of noises?" It sounded like someone walking around my house. Maybe around midnight, Harold frowned, as if genuinely concerned. "That's odd." I didn't hear anything, but my bedroom's at the back of my house. "Do you think you should call the police?" His response seemed entirely sincere. There were no signs of nervousness or guilt. In fact, he seemed genuinely worried about my safety. "Probably just an animal," I said, though I didn't believe my own words. "Even so," Harold said, "you should be careful." "A woman alone." Well, you never know what kind of strange people might be wandering around at night. The way he said, "a woman alone," sent chills down my spine. There was nothing overtly threatening in his words, but there was a quality to his tone that I couldn't quite place. The events of May marked a turning point in what had started as occasional surveillance and became something far more invasive and terrifying. The nighttime walks around my property became more frequent. 2 or 3 times a week, around midnight, or 2 in the morning, I would hear the familiar footsteps making their slow circuit around my house. Always the same pattern, starting on the side bordering Harold's property, moving to my backyard, then around the other side to the front entrance, before returning to the starting point. But what made these events particularly disturbing was what began to accompany them. During these nighttime walks, whoever was outside started testing the doors and windows. The first time this happened, I was in my bedroom reading when I heard the unmistakable sound of someone trying the handle of my back door. It wasn't the sound of someone trying to force entry. It was subtler, as if someone was carefully checking if the door was locked. My blood ran cold. I stayed completely still, holding my breath, listening. After a few moments, I heard footsteps moving from the back door to the side of the house. Then, the distinct sound of a window being gently tested. Whoever was outside was systematically inspecting every possible entry point to my house. I called 911 that night, But when the police arrived 20 minutes later, there was no one on my property. The officers did a quick search around my house with flashlights but found no evidence of an intruder. "Are you sure it wasn't animals?" one of the officers asked. "Raccoons can make noises that sound surprisingly human." "It wasn't animals," I insisted. "Someone was testing my doors and windows." "Did you see the person?" "Not clearly, but I'm sure someone was there." The officer took a report, but I could tell from his expression that he thought I might be overreacting. They gave me a case number and told me to call immediately if anything else happened. After the police left, I couldn't sleep. The thought that someone had been so close to breaking into my house, that they had been systematically assessing my defenses, filled me with an anxiety I had never experienced before. The next day, I installed motion sensor security lights around the entire perimeter of my house. I also bought additional locks for all my doors and security bars for the first floor windows. Harold commented on the new security measures when he saw me installing them. "I guess last night's trouble really scared you," he said over the fence while I was setting up a light in my backyard. "How did you know about last night's trouble?" I asked. I didn't recall specifically mentioning what had happened. Harold paused for a moment, as if realizing he had revealed more knowledge than he should have. "I saw the police car lights," he said finally. "I assumed something had happened." It was a reasonable explanation, but something about the way he had paused before answering made me uneasy. "I just want to feel safer," I said. "Of course," Harold replied. "A woman alone can't be too careful these days." Once again, that phrase, "a woman alone." And once again, the way he said it made me feel as if there was an underlying meaning I wasn't fully grasping. The security lights worked for about a week. Every time they were triggered by nighttime movement, I would wake up and look out the windows, but usually I only saw stray cats or the occasional raccoon. But on the night of the 23rd of May, the lights went off at 12:47 in the morning, and when I looked out my bedroom window, I saw something that filled me with absolute terror. Harold was standing in my backyard, completely still under the bright glow of the motion sensor light, staring directly up at my bedroom window. He wasn't trying to hide. He wasn't acting as if he'd been caught doing something he shouldn't. He was just standing there on my private property at nearly 1 in the morning, staring at me. We locked eyes for what felt like several minutes, but was probably only a few seconds. Then, unhurriedly, Harold turned and walked calmly back toward his own property, disappearing into the darkness beyond the reach of my security lights. I called the police immediately, but by the time they arrived, Harold was gone. This time, however, I had evidence. The security lights had basic cameras built in, and they had captured video of Harold on my property. "It's definitely trespassing," the officer admitted when I showed him the video on my phone. "Do you want to press charges?" "Should I?" "That's your decision. But we could at least go talk to him. Let him know you're aware of his behavior and that he's not welcome on your property." We decided the officers would go speak to Harold. I stayed in my house while they walked to Harold's door and knocked. I could see from my window that Harold opened the door immediately, as if he had been awake and waiting. The conversation lasted about 10 minutes. I couldn't hear what was being said, but Harold seemed to be cooperating fully with the officers. He even invited them into his house, presumably to show there was nothing suspicious about his behavior. When the officers returned to my house, they filled me in on the conversation. "Mr. Jenkins says he was having insomnia and decided to take a walk," one of the officers told me. "He says he didn't realize he had wandered onto your property and apologizes for the misunderstanding." Misunderstanding. He was standing in my yard, staring directly at my bedroom window. He says he was looking up because the light startled him. He says as soon as he realized where he was, he left. And you believe him? The officers exchanged a glance. "Ma'am, we can't arrest someone for being on a neighbor's property, especially when he says it was an accident. But we've made it very clear that he's not to be on your property for any reason. And if it happens again, he'll face charges." After the police left, I felt frustrated and unprotected. Harold had clearly been stalking me for weeks, had been on my property without permission, and had been watching my house in ways that were obviously invasive. But because he had provided a seemingly reasonable explanation, and because he hadn't done anything violent, the authorities treated it as a minor misunderstanding. The next morning, Harold approached the fence between our properties while I was in my yard. "Nayla," he said, using my name for the first time in our years as neighbors. "I wanted to apologize for last night. I didn't realize I had wandered onto your property. I was distracted and wasn't paying attention." His apology seemed sincere, and his body language was that of someone genuinely embarrassed by an honest mistake. "Harold, you've been acting strange for weeks," I said directly. "The nighttime walks, watching my house, monitoring my schedule. What's going on?" Harold looked genuinely confused. "Nighttime walks? Monitoring your schedule? Nayla, I don't know what you're talking about." "Harold, I've seen you. I've heard the footsteps around my house multiple times." "Nayla," Harold said, his voice filled with what seemed like genuine concern, "I think you might be under a lot of stress. Working those night shifts, living alone, sometimes stress can make us perceive things that aren't really happening." The way he said this made me doubt myself for a moment. Was it possible I had been imagining some of the incidents? That the stress and lack of sleep were causing me to misinterpret innocent behaviors? "But last night," I began. "Last night I made a mistake," Harold said firmly. "I was walking. I wasn't paying attention, and I accidentally wandered onto your property. It was completely innocent, but I understand why it scared you." His explanation was consistent with what he had told the police, and his delivery was so earnest that I started to wonder if I had been overreacting to the situation in my mind. "Just, please stay on your own property from now on," I said. "Of course," Harold replied. "And Nayla, if you ever feel unsafe or need help with anything, don't hesitate to ask me. Neighbors should look out for each other." That conversation left me feeling confused and second-guessing my own perceptions. Harold had seemed so genuine, so concerned for my well-being, that I began to wonder if I had been imagining patterns that didn't exist. For the next 2 weeks, Harold was the perfect neighbor. He waved cordially when we saw each other, but never initiated long conversations. I saw no signs of the nighttime walks or the surveillance behavior I had been noticing before. I started to relax, thinking that maybe my confrontation and the police incident had resolved the issue. Maybe Harold had genuinely been behaving innocently, and my stress from work had caused me to interpret his actions as more sinister than they were. But then, on the night of the 8th of June, everything changed again. It was a particularly hot night, and I had left my bedroom window slightly open to let in some fresh air. I was in that transitional stage between awake and asleep when I heard a sound that woke me fully. The unmistakable sound of someone slowly climbing the steps of my front porch. My wooden steps were old and creaky, and each one made a distinct sound when stepped on. I knew those sounds intimately after years of living in the house. I stayed completely still in my bed, listening. The footsteps reached my front door, then stopped. I heard the sound of my door handle being gently tested. My heart started pounding so hard, I was sure it could be heard. I had locked all the locks before going to bed, as I always did, but the sound of someone trying my door at 2 a.m. filled me with terror. The footsteps moved from my front door to the side of my house. I could hear the sound of windows being systematically tested. First the living room windows, then the kitchen, then the dining room. Whoever was outside was doing a thorough inspection of every possible entry point to my house, exactly as had happened before. Silently, I slid out of my bed and crept to my bedroom window. I carefully moved the curtain just enough to peer down at my side yard. The moonlight was bright enough that I could clearly see the silhouette of a figure moving slowly along my house, stopping at each window to test if it was secure. Though the figure was mostly in shadow, the size and shape felt familiar. It was Harold. As I watched, Harold completed his circuit around my house and returned to my back door. This time, he didn't just test the handle. I could hear sounds suggesting he was doing something more elaborate, possibly trying to pick the lock or find a way to open it. That was enough. I called 911 again. 911, what's your emergency? There's someone trying to break into my house, I whispered. They're at my back door right now, trying to open the lock. Can you see the person? Yes, it's my neighbor. He's been stalking me for weeks. Is the person armed? I don't know. I can't see clearly. Stay on the line. Units are on the way. While I waited for the police to arrive, I kept watching Harold from my window. He spent at least 5 more minutes working on my back door before finally giving up and walking back toward his own property. When the police arrived, Harold was gone again, but this time there was physical evidence of his attempt. Scratch marks around my back door lock that hadn't been there before, and shoe prints in the soft mud near my door. Someone was definitely here, one of the officers confirmed after examining the evidence with a flashlight. Are you sure it was your neighbor? Completely sure. This time, when the officers went to confront Harold, his story was different. Harold Jenkins says he hasn't been out of his house all night, the officer told me when he returned. He says he's been watching TV and then sleeping since 10 in the evening. That's impossible. I saw him with my own eyes. He also says he's worried about you, ma'am. He says you've been acting erratically, making false accusations, and that you might be having some kind of nervous breakdown. The officer's words hit me like a punch to the stomach. Harold wasn't just denying what he had done. He was trying to make me look mentally unstable. Officer, I have evidence. The marks on my lock, the footprints. Yes, someone was definitely here. But without more evidence to specifically connect Mr. Jenkins to the incident, we can't make an arrest. What kind of evidence do you need? Clear video, fingerprints, multiple witnesses. Something that conclusively proves he was the one here. After the police left, I felt more vulnerable and isolated than ever. Harold was escalating his behavior, but he had also become more careful about how he did it. And worse, he was actively working to undermine my credibility with the authorities. The days following the second police incident brought a dramatic shift in the dynamic between Harold and me. Instead of avoiding me or acting embarrassed about being confronted, Harold started being actively friendly in ways that I found deeply unsettling. Every time he saw me in my yard, he would approach the fence to strike up a conversation. But his conversations always included subtle comments about my mental well-being, or suggestions that I might be under excessive stress. Nayla, you look tired, he would say. Have you been sleeping okay? I know those night shifts can be tough on the mind, or I hope you're not still worried about those nighttime noises. Sometimes when we're stressed, our imagination can take us to dark places. The most disturbing part was how these conversations felt like deliberate gaslighting, attempts to make me question my own perception of the events I had experienced. Harold also began reaching out to other neighbors, apparently to express concern about my mental health. I learned about this when Mrs. Patterson, an older neighbor who lived across the street, approached me while I was picking up my mail. Dear, Mrs. Patterson said, Harold Jenkins came to me yesterday. He's worried about you. Worried how? He says you've been accusing him of strange things, calling the police, that you might be having some kind of personal issues. My heart sank. Harold was systematically working to destroy my reputation in the neighborhood, establishing a narrative that I was a mentally unstable woman harassing an innocent neighbor. Mrs. Patterson, I said, Harold has been stalking me. He's been on my property at night trying to break into my house. Mrs. Patterson looked at me with an expression of sympathy that clearly indicated she didn't fully believe me. Dear, have you considered talking to someone? A counselor, maybe? Stress can manifest in very real ways. That conversation made me realize Harold had skillfully built a situation where anything I said about his behavior would be interpreted as evidence of my supposed mental instability. Over the next few weeks, Harold's nighttime attempts to access my house continued, but they became more sophisticated. Instead of just testing doors and windows, he started using tools. I heard sounds of lock manipulation, attempts to pry windows open with crowbars, and even what sounded like attempts to remove window screens. Every time I called the police, Harold had perfect alibis. He had always been sleeping or watching TV and expressed growing concern about my nighttime episodes. I installed more sophisticated security cameras, but Harold seemed aware of their locations. His nighttime approaches always avoided the camera's angles, or happened on nights when the cameras inexplicably malfunctioned due to technical issues. I began to suspect Harold had specialized knowledge of security systems, possibly acquired through his work as an accountant for several local businesses, including some security companies. The situation reached a breaking point in mid-July. The night of the 16th of July was the most terrifying of my life. I had been working a particularly exhausting shift at the hospital. We had multiple emergencies, including a multi-car accident with several casualties, and I got home around 8 in the morning completely drained. All I wanted was to take a shower and sleep until the afternoon. I had taken mild sleeping pills to help me sleep during daylight hours, something I occasionally did after particularly stressful shifts. I woke up around 3 in the morning with the distinct feeling that something was terribly wrong. The house felt different somehow, colder, as if a door or window had been open for hours. I stayed still in my bed, listening. The house was silent, but it was an occupied silence, as if there was a presence being deliberately quiet. Slowly, I sat up in my bed and looked around my bedroom. Everything seemed normal in the dim light filtering in from the streetlights. But then I heard something that chilled my blood. The distinct sound of my wooden stairs creaking, but from inside my house. Someone was inside my house, moving slowly up my staircase. For a moment, I was paralyzed with terror. Then, silently, I slid out of my bed and crept toward my window. If I could get to my phone and call the police without alerting whoever was in my house. But when I reached for my phone on my nightstand, it wasn't there. I had left it charging in the kitchen before going to bed. The sounds on the stairs stopped, replaced by the sound of someone carefully moving around my first floor. Whoever was downstairs was being deliberately quiet, but the old floors of my house betrayed every movement. I stayed crouched by my window for what felt like hours, listening to the person move through my house. I could track their progress by the sounds, first in my living room, then my kitchen, then my dining room. The most terrifying part was that whoever was downstairs seemed to know my house intimately. They knew exactly which floorboards creaked, where the furniture was located, how to move through the space with minimal noise. After what felt like an eternity, the sounds moved back toward my stairs. This time, whoever was downstairs was coming up. My terror reached a new level. I was trapped on the second floor, with no phone, no obvious way to escape, and an intruder approaching my bedroom. The footsteps on the stairs were deliberately slow, as if whoever was climbing was savoring my fear or trying to prolong the terror. When the footsteps reached the second floor landing, I realized I had to take action. I couldn't just stay crouched by my window, waiting for something horrible to happen. Silently, I moved to my closet, where I kept a baseball bat I had bought years earlier for personal protection, but had never needed to use. The footsteps moved down my second floor hallway, pausing briefly outside my office, then outside my bathroom, before finally stopping outside my bedroom. My bedroom door was closed, but it didn't have a lock. Whoever was on the other side could enter whenever they wanted. For several minutes, there was no sound. It was as if whoever was outside my door was simply waiting. Then slowly, my door handle began to turn. As my bedroom door began to open slowly, I experienced a clarity of thought I hadn't felt in months of nighttime terror. I was no longer a passive victim of someone else's psychological games. It was time to fight. I gripped the baseball bat firmly and positioned myself beside my door, where I would be hidden when it opened fully. The door opened inch by inch, clearly with the intent of making no noise. A familiar silhouette appeared in my doorway. Harold, dressed entirely in black, moving with the stealth of someone who had done this before. He stepped fully into my bedroom and moved toward my bed, apparently assuming I would be sleeping there. That's when I acted. "Harold!" I shouted, flipping on the bedroom light at the same time. Harold spun toward me, his face showing genuine shock at being confronted. In his hands, he held what looked like ropes and something that might have been chloroform or another sedative chemical. "Nayla," he said, his voice surprisingly calm for someone caught in the act of breaking and entering. "You shouldn't have woken up." "Get out of my house now," I yelled, raising the baseball bat threateningly. Harold didn't move toward the door. Instead, he took a step toward me. "Nayla, you've been very stressed lately. Everyone in the neighborhood is worried about you. I thought maybe you might need help to relax." Even in this moment of direct confrontation, Harold was trying to gaslight me, to make it seem like his breaking into my house was somehow an act of neighborly concern. I said, "Get out." "I can't do that, Nayla. You've been causing too many problems. Calling the police, bothering the neighbors with your stories. It's time for you to rest." Harold took another step toward me, and that's when I realized he had no intention of leaving peacefully. His eyes had a quality I had never seen before, a cold, calculating look that suggested he had crossed a mental line from which there was no return. "Harold, the police know about you. If you do anything to me, you'll be the first suspect." Harold laughed, a sound that had no humor in it. "Nayla, the police think you're having a nervous breakdown. The neighbors think you're mentally unstable. If something happens to you, they're going to assume it was self-inflicted, the tragic result of a young woman who couldn't handle the stress of living alone." The cold logic of his plan hit me like a bolt of lightning. Harold had been meticulously building a narrative for months that would make me seem suicidal or mentally unstable. If he killed me and made it look like a suicide, his story would be believable to anyone who had been observing the situation from the outside. "But first," Harold continued, moving the ropes in his hands suggestively, "you're going to help me with some personal issues I've been having." The implication of his words was clear, and it filled me with a rage that overpowered my fear. "Never!" I screamed, swinging the bat toward him. Harold moved toward me quickly, trying to grab the bat, but years of physical work at the hospital had given me more strength than he had anticipated. I managed to connect the bat with his shoulder, sending him stumbling back. "Bitch!" he shouted, his mask of calm finally slipping to reveal the rage he had been hiding for months. Harold lunged at me again, this time with full aggression. We struggled over the bat, crashing into furniture and walls. During the fight, Harold revealed a physical strength and viciousness that made me realize he had been suppressing his true nature for years. But I was fighting for my life, and that gave me an edge he hadn't anticipated. I managed to break free from his grip and run to my bedroom window. Without hesitation, I threw it open fully and began screaming as loudly as I could. "Help! Help! There's someone in my house! Call the police!" Harold tried to reach me to silence me, but I kept screaming while using the bat to keep distance between us. Within minutes, I could see lights turning on in neighboring houses. Mrs. Patterson appeared at her second-floor window, clearly trying to figure out where the screams were coming from. "Mrs. Patterson," I shouted, "call the police. Harold is in my house." Harold realized his plan had completely unraveled. He could no longer harm me and make it look like a suicide. There were too many witnesses to an actual struggle. Instead of continuing to try to attack me, Harold ran to my bedroom door and fled my house as quickly as he had entered. This time, when the police arrived, they found abundant evidence that Harold had been in my house. His fingerprints were on my door, he had dropped some of the ropes during our struggle, and multiple neighbors had heard the commotion and could testify that there had been a real altercation. More importantly, Mrs. Patterson had clearly seen Harold running out of my house and heading toward his own property. "There's no question about what happened this time," the detective who took my statement told me. We have physical evidence, multiple witnesses, and Mr. Jenkins has no alibi for tonight. When the police went to arrest Harold, they found even more disturbing evidence in his house. He had detailed photographs of my daily routine taken over months, blueprints of my house he had meticulously drawn, and what appeared to be a kidnapping kit that included ropes, sedatives, and tools for picking locks. They also found a journal where he had documented his plans for me in absolutely terrifying detail. Harold had been planning to kidnap me, sexually assault me, and then kill me in a way that would look like suicide. He had been studying my schedule, my routines, and my vulnerabilities for months, waiting for the perfect opportunity. "Ma'am," the detective told me when he briefed me on what they had found, "you came incredibly close to becoming the victim of a very dangerous and calculated predator. Your decision to fight back probably saved your life." Harold was arrested and eventually charged with multiple felonies: breaking and entering, aggravated stalking, attempted kidnapping, and possession of drugs with intent to use them in the commission of a crime. During the legal process that followed, additional details about Harold came to light that explained his behavior. He had been fired from previous jobs for inappropriate behavior toward female colleagues, had restraining orders against him from former girlfriends, and had been in court-mandated therapy for obsessive behavior, though it had apparently been ineffective. The psychological profile compiled during his pre-sentencing evaluation described him as a high-functioning psychopath who had been able to maintain a facade of normalcy while simultaneously planning and executing sophisticated predatory behaviors. Mr. Jenkins represents a particularly dangerous type of predator, the forensic psychologist testified. His ability to appear normal and even sympathetic while simultaneously discrediting his victims makes it extremely difficult for authorities to recognize the threat he poses until it's almost too late. Harold was sentenced to 15 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 10 years. But for me, the damage was already done. Even after Harold was arrested and sentenced, I couldn't continue living in that house. Every nighttime sound made me jump. Every shadow in my yard filled me with panic. Every time I came home from work, I had to obsessively check the entire house to make sure no one had broken in. The months of psychological terror had left scars that couldn't be healed simply by knowing Harold was in prison. My home, which had once been my sanctuary, had become a place of constant trauma. There was also the issue of the neighbors. While some, like Mrs. Patterson, had eventually believed me and supported me, others never fully got over the doubts Harold had sown about my mental stability. Some still looked at me with the pitying expression reserved for people who have had nervous breakdowns. But the hardest part was the feeling that I could never feel completely safe in that place. Harold had shown how easy it was for someone with malicious intent to invade my private life without being detected. He had shown how vulnerable it was to live alone in an isolated house, especially when the predator was someone who intimately knew my routine and vulnerabilities. 3 months after Harold was sentenced, I put my house up for sale. It was a financially difficult decision. I had to sell below market value because I couldn't wait for the best price, but it was necessary for my mental well-being. I moved into an apartment in a complex with 24-hour security, surveillance cameras, and multiple neighbors in close proximity. It wasn't as beautiful as my Victorian house, and it certainly didn't have the same sense of privacy and tranquility, but it gave me something I had completely lost: the ability to sleep at night without constant terror. I also changed jobs, moving to a hospital in a different city where no one knew my story. It was important to me to rebuild my professional life without the constant shadow of what I had experienced. Therapy has been essential in my recovery process. I've learned to recognize the symptoms of PTSD I developed as a result of months of psychological terror. I've learned techniques to manage the hypervigilance and occasional panic attacks I still experience, but I've also learned important lessons about trusting my instincts. For months, I let Harold make me doubt my own perceptions. I let his gaslighting tactics make me question the evidence of my own senses. I will never again let someone make me doubt my own reality like that. Now, 5 years later, I've finally started to rebuild my sense of personal safety. I live in a new city, have new friends who don't know my trauma story, and I've slowly started dating again. But the lessons I learned during those months of terror will never leave me. I've learned to be more aware of my surroundings, more protective of my personal information, and more willing to trust my instincts when something feels wrong. I've also learned the importance of having a strong support system. The isolation I experienced, both physical and emotional, made me more vulnerable to Harold's tactics. Now, I maintain stronger relationships with family and friends, and I make sure the important people in my life know where I am and how I'm doing. The experience fundamentally changed me, but it didn't break me. If anything, it made me stronger, more aware, and more determined to never be a victim of predators like Harold Jenkins. And if any woman is reading this and recognizes elements of her own experience, a neighbor who seems to know too much about your routine, who shows up in unusual places, who makes comments that make you uncomfortable, trust your instincts. Document everything, seek support, and don't let anyone make you doubt your own perception of reality. Predators like Harold rely on our desire to be polite, to give the benefit of the doubt, to not cause trouble. They use our socialization as women against us, knowing we often doubt ourselves before doubting them. But your instincts exist for a reason. Your sense of unease is valid information. Your fear is an appropriate response to real threats. Don't ignore those signals. Don't rationalize them away. And don't let anyone, even the authorities, make you feel like you're overreacting when you know in your heart something is wrong. That's the most important lesson I learned from my experience with Harold Jenkins, that sometimes moving away isn't a defeat. Sometimes it's the bravest and smartest decision you can make. And that's why, in the end, I had to move.